It started with a sound a crack, sharp and sudden. I froze mid-step, my breath fogging the icy air in front of me. The frozen lake stretched endlessly under the pale light of the moon, its surface so smooth it looked like polished glass. I had wandered too far from the cabin, chasing the strange lights that flickered in the distance. But now, everything was silent. The world felt too big, too empty. I shouldn't have been out there alone. The crack came again, louder this time, like the ice protesting my weight. I glanced down, expecting to see fractures spider-webbing beneath my boots, but the surface was unbroken. Relief swept over me for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by unease. The sound hadn't come from underfoot, it was ahead of me. The ice shimmered faintly, catching the silver of the moonlight. I squinted, trying to see further, but my breath clouded my vision. The lights I had followed were gone now, as though they had never been there. Only the silence remained. That's when I noticed my reflection. It shouldn't have been there, not clearly. The moonlight wasn't strong enough, and yet I could see it perfectly figure crouched on the ice, staring back at me. At first, I thought it was just the way light played tricks on the surface, but as I moved closer, the reflection didn't shift the way it should have. It stayed centered, watching me. A chill crawled up my spine that had nothing to do with the freezing air. My mouth went dry as I knelt cautiously, my knees pressing into the cold surface. I leaned closer, staring at the reflection. My face stared back, the same dark circles under my eyes, same scarf wrapped tightly against the cold. But something was wrong. It wasn't quite me. Its eyes didn't blink. Mine did. I stood up quickly, almost slipping on the slick surface, and backed away. My reflection stayed where it was, crouched like an animal ready to pounce. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to breathe, the air burning my throat. I told myself it was a trick of the light. I told myself it was just my imagination, stirred up by the isolation and the biting cold. But deep down, I knew better. "Hello?" My voice cracked, sounding small against the vast emptiness. The reflection's lips didn't move. It didn't mimic me at all. I took another step back. The reflection followed, not by rising, but by sliding across the ice like a shadow. My stomach twisted, and panic set in. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. That's when it winked at me. My legs nearly gave out. The motion was subtle, like someone sharing a private joke, but the malice in it was undeniable. My reflection wasn't mine, it never had been. I spun around, my boots scraping against the ice, and bolted toward the shore. My breath came in, frantic bursts, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The sound of my steps echoed unnaturally, as if the ice was mocking my escape. I didn't dare look back. The trees loomed ahead, their dark shapes promising safety, but the lake stretched on longer than it should have. My steps faltered. No matter how far I ran, the shore didn't seem to get any closer. Behind me, I heard the scrape of something moving across the ice. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my blood ran cold. It was following Menet, walking, not running, just gliding, its limbs twisted and unnatural. It moved like it was part of the ice itself, like it belonged there. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my legs, the sharp sting of the cold in my lungs. Could feel it getting closer, a pressure building behind me, heavy and suffocating. Finally, the edge of the lake appeared ahead, the snow-covered ground just beyond. I threw myself forward, scrambling off the ice and collapsing into the snow. My fingers clawed at the earth, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and the frozen expanse. For a moment, everything was silent again. I turned, trembling, expecting to see it still on the ice. But the lake was empty. My reflection, the thing that had been pretending to be my reflection, was gone. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to believe I was safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. I staggered back to the cabin, my legs barely supporting me. The small building felt suffocating when I finally shut the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. The fire had died down, leaving only embers that glowed faintly in the dark. I collapsed in front of it, desperate for warmth. My mind raced, replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of what had happened. Exhaustion finally claimed me, pulling me into a restless sleep. I woke to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but the rhythm was too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. My heart sank as I realized it was coming from the glass. I turned my head slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. There, outside the window, was my face. The same hollow eyes, the same pale skin, but its mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It raised a hand and waved at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The thing pressed its face closer to the glass, its breath fogging the surface. With one finger, it began to trace something into the frost. "Let me in." The words were jagged, each stroke slow and deliberate. My body refused to obey me as I sat, frozen, watching it smile wider, its teeth sharp and gleaming. I don't remember how long I stayed like that, locked in a staring contest with the thing wearing my face. But when dawn finally broke, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint outline of its message etched into the frost. I haven't gone near the lake since. I've tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by the isolation and the cold. But every time I pass by the mirror in the cold cabin, I feel its gaze lingering, as though it's waiting for me to slip. I don't trust my reflection anymore. And now, neither should you. The wind bit at my face as I trudged through the frozen forest, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound. The trees loomed tall and dark, their skeletal branches clawing at the gray sky above. I didn't want to be here, but the storm was coming in fast, and I needed to find shelter. The cabin I was staying in was too far now. My only hope was the old ranger's hut I'd seen on the Mappa place, abandoned for years, but still standing. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of distant animals. Just me and the endless stretch of white, broken only by the thin black silhouettes of trees. I told myself the cold was the reason my hands shook, but I knew better. Something about this forest felt wrong. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but I heard it, clear enough to freeze me in place. It said my name. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. The forest played tricks on you. After all, the sound of the wind could twist and shift, making you hear things that weren't there. But then it came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. My name, a voice I didn't recognize. My breath caught in my throat, and I scanned the forest around me. There was no one there, just endless trees, their shadows stretching long and dark in the dim light. I called out, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" No answer, only the wind, swirling the snow in ghostly shapes around me. I told myself to keep moving, to focus on finding the hut, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The voice had come from deeper in the forest, to my left. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to keep going, but a part of me, some foolish, curious part, urged me to follow. Maybe someone was lost, calling for help. Maybe I wasn't alone out here after all. The voice called again, softer this time, like a whisper carried on the wind. It sounded closer. I turned, stepping off the narrow trail and into the trees. The snow was deeper here, slowing my steps, but I pushed forward, my heart pounding. I didn't call out again. I didn't want to hear my name repeated, twisting in that strange, unfamiliar voice. The deeper I went, the darker it seemed to get. The sky, once a dull gray, now felt smothered by heavy clouds. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a tangled canopy above me. The air was colder here, biting through my jacket and stinging my skin. And then, ahead of me, I saw footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the snow, a single set, leading further into the forest. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at them. They were too small to belong to me, and yet they matched the pattern of my boots exactly. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I heard my name again this time, right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. No figure, no movement, just the empty forest. My legs trembled, and I nearly dropped to my knees. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The voice came again, closer, more urgent. It wasn't behind me anymore, it was ahead. I turned back to the footprints. They were leading toward a clearing I could just barely make out, through the trees. My mind screamed at me to go back to the trail, to forget the voice, but my feet moved on their own, following the tracks. The snow seemed heavier now, falling in thick flakes that blurred my vision, but I pressed on, drawn forward by a pull I couldn't explain. The clearing was small, a patch of bare ground surrounded by a circle of twisted, gnarled trees. In the center stood a figure, their back to me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. They were dressed like me, a thick jacket, snow, covered boots, gloves. But something was wrong. Their posture was stiff, unnatural, like a puppet held up by invisible strings. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, and the snow crunched beneath my boots. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. Slowly, the figure began to turn, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, as though they were unused to their own body. When they faced me, I staggered back, my stomach lurching. It was me. The face was mine, down to the smallest detail. But the eyes were wrong. They were empty, black as the void, staring through me with a cold, lifeless gaze. The mouth twisted into a blank, grotesque smile, the lips moving soundlessly. Then, it spoke. My voice, distorted and hollow, repeated the words I had said earlier. "Who's there?" The sound shattered me. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the snow, my lungs burning with the effort. The trees blurred around me as I stumbled back the way I had come, desperate to escape the clearing, the figure, the voice. But the forest didn't let me go. The trees seemed to shift, closing in around me, their branches clawing at my jacket. The wind howled louder, carrying my name over and over, twisting it into something unrecognizable. I tried to follow my footprints back, but they were gone, erased by the falling snow. The voice came again, closer now, surrounding me. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was many, overlapping, echoing, filling the forest with a haunting cacophony. They all said my name, over and over, like a chant. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees, the cold seeping through my clothes. I pressed my clothiers and lead, hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, crawling under my skin, filling every corner of my mind. I don't remember how I made it out of the forest. One moment, I was on my knees, surrounded by the endless echoes of my name. The next, I was stumbling through the door of the ranger's hut, slamming it shut behind me. The voices stopped. The silence was deafening. I collapsed on the floor, shivering uncontrollably. The hut was dark, the air stale and cold, but it was a refuge. I thought I was safe, but as I lay there, my head resting against the wooden floor, I heard it again, faint, barely, audible, coming from the shadows in the corner. My name. I didn't look. I couldn't, but I felt it, something watching me, something waiting. And then it whispered, in my own voice, "You shouldn't have come here." I first saw the cabin during the summer. It sat deep in the woods, hidden behind a wall of overgrown trees and tangled brush. I had been hiking alone, trying to escape the noise of the city, when I stumbled upon it. The air around it felt still, unnaturally quiet, as if even the birds were come near. The cabin looked abandoned. The wood was gray and weathered, the roof sagging in places. Ivy climbed its walls like long creeping fingers. But what caught my attention was the door. It was pristine, out of place in its surroundings. Smooth, dark wood, polished to a shine, with a brass handle that gleamed as though it had just been cleaned. No lock, no scratches, no sign of wear. I stepped closer, curiosity tugging at me, but the second my hand reached for the handle, a chill ran through me. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel on your skin, it was deeper, like ice, spreading through my veins. I pulled my hand back, and the feeling disappeared as quickly as it came. Something about that door wasn't right. I tried to open it anyway. The handle turned easily, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt like it was stuck, or maybe locked from the other side. After a few minutes of trying, I gave up and continued my hike, telling myself it was just an old cabin with a stuck door. But the memory of it lingered, haunting the edges of my thoughts. Months passed, and summer turned to fall, then to winter. The woods were different now, blanketed in snow and deathly silent. I hadn't planned on coming back, but something about that cabin gnawed at me. The path I'd taken before was nearly unrecognizable under the snow, but I found my way through sheer determination, or maybe something else was guiding me. When I finally saw the cabin again, my breath caught in my throat. It looked the same as it had before, except for one thing. The door was open. A thin crack of darkness stretched between the door and its frame, as if inviting me in. My stomach twisted, every instinct telling me to leave, but my feet moved forward on their own, crunching through the snow. The closer I got, the colder the air became, the kind of cold that bites deep and doesn't let go. I stood in front of the door, staring at the shadowy interior. The darkness inside was thick, almost solid, like the cabin was swallowing all the light around it. I wanted to turn back, but a part of me's stubborn, reckless part needed to know what was inside. I crossed the threshold. The air inside was icy, far colder than it had been outside. My breath hung in the air like smoke. As I stepped further in, my boots echoing on the wooden floor. The room was Burano furniture, no fireplace, just four walls, and a floor covered in frost. The only thing that stood out was a second door on the opposite side of the room. It looked exactly like the first, smooth, polished wood with a gleaming brass handle. Something about it felt wrong, even more wrong than the first door. The air around it was heavy, pressing down on me like a weight, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers touched it, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed through the cabin, impossibly loud in the empty space. My heart pounded as I spun around, but the door I'd entered through was gone. In its place was a blank wall, smooth and featureless, as though the door had never been there at all. Panic clawed at my chest. I tried to stay calm, to convince myself there had to be another way out, but when I turned back to the second door, my breath caught in my throat. It was open. The darkness beyond it was absolute, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. But there was movement, something shifting just out of sight. I stepped back, my legs trembling, but the floor beneath me creaked and groaned, as if warning me not to turn away. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. It came from the darkness beyond the door, soft, sweet, like a lullaby. But there was something off about it, something hollow and wrong. Voice grew louder, more insistent, echoing in my head until it was all I could hear. I didn't realize I was moving until I stood at the edge of the doorway, staring into the void. My body felt like it wasn't my own, like I was being pulled forward by invisible strings. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones, but I couldn't stop. The voice whispered again, closer this time. It wasn't a single voice anymore, it was many, overlapping, blending together in a twisted harmony. They sounded familiar, like echoes of people I once knew, but distorted, wrong. And then I saw it. Something stepped out of the darkness. At first, it looked human, but as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was blank, smooth and featureless, like a mask. And yet, when it put its head toward me, I felt its gaze. The first thing I noticed was the cold, not the kind that makes you pull the blanket tighter, or shiver. It was deeper, sharper. It sank into my bones and made my body feel heavy, as though I were carved out of ice. I opened my eyes, and my breath caught in my throat. Frost sparkled on the ceiling above me, delicate patterns stretching out like spider webs. I turned my head slowly, and my heart began to pound. My pillow, my blanket, Even the bedside table, they were covered in frost. But what made my stomach drop was the sight of my own skin. My arms lay exposed outside the covers, and they were coated in a thin layer of ice crystals. My fingers looked pale, the frost clinging to the edges of my nails. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body was sluggish, like it had forgotten how. My joints ached, and a dull panic began to rise in my chest. I forced myself to lift my arm, the frost cracking and falling away in tines. The sensation was almost painful, like ripping off something that had grown into me. My breath came in, shallow gasps, each exhale forming a visible cloud in the freezing air. The room was wrong. It wasn't just cold, it felt empty, like all warmth and life had been sucked out. My alarm clock on the bedside table was dark, its numbers frozen over. The window, which had been firmly shut when I went to bed, was wide open, snow drifting in onto the sill. I couldn't remember opening it. Swinging my legs over the side of the bed, I winced as my feet touched the icy floor. The frost on my skin flaked off as I moved, leaving my skin red and raw. I needed to close the window to figure out what was happening, but every step felt like wading through deep snow. As I approached the window, I stopped. Footprints. They trailed from the open window to my bed, and then stopped right next to where I had been, sleeping. The prints weren't mine. They were too large, and the shape of them wasn't quite right. They were long and narrow, with claw-like indentations at the tips of each step. My chest tightened, and I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But the room was empty. The footprints were the only sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. The snow drifting in from the window was fine and powdery, but it didn't melt when it touched the floor. It seemed to blend with the frost that already covered everything. The air felt heavier by the second, pressing down on me, and my breath came quicker. I reached out to shut the window, but as my fingers brushed the frame, a sound froze me in place. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from outside, carried on the cold wind. A low, mournful sound like someone crying. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I leaned out cautiously, peering into the snow-covered yard below. The night was eerily still, the trees standing like dark skeletons against the pale snow. Nothing moved, but the crying continued, distant yet somehow right next to me, as the wind itself was weeping. "Hello?" My voice cracked, barely audible over the sound. The crying stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I started to back away from the window, my legs trembling. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. It was tall, impossibly so, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its body was thin and pale, almost blending with the snow, and its facier, what should have been its face, was blank, featureless. It stood motionless, as though it were waiting. Then it moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided, its limbs dragging behind it as it crossed the snow without disturbing it. The footprints it left behind were the same ones I had seen in my room. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, slamming the window shut. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I fumbled to lock it, my fingers stiff and numb. The frost on the glass began to spread, growing rapidly, until the window was entirely obscured. But I could still feel it. Whatever that thing was, it was still there, watching. I turned back to my bed, desperate to find my phone, to call someone, anyone. But as I crossed the room, the frost beneath my feet cracked like thin ice, and I felt the temperature drop even further. Then I heard it. A knock. It came from the window, slow and deliberate, the sound echoing in the frozen silence. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, pressing my back against the bed. The knock came again, louder, this time, followed by another, and another. It wasn't tapping to get in, it was mocking. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like it was inside my head, rattling my skull. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming, the taste of blood sharp on my tongue, and then it spoke. A voice and not a cry this time, but a whisper, low and guttural. It spoke my name, stretching each syllable like it was tasting the sound. The air around me seemed to vibrate with the word, the frost creeping closer to where I sat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The knocking stopped. When I opened my eyes, the room was still. The frost no longer spread, and the air, while cold, was no longer suffocating. I crawled to the window, dreading what I might see, but when I wiped away the frost, the yard was empty. The footprints were gone. The figure had vanished, but the frost on my skin remained. It hasn't gone away, no matter what I do. My body feels colder every day, the ice spreading further. I see the figure in my dreams now, standing at the edge of the trees, its blank face turned toward me, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes back. It was supposed to be a quick walk, just a way to clear my head. The snow had fallen thick, overnight, blanketing the world in silence. I loved that kind of stillness, the way it felt like time had paused, holding its breath. The forest behind my house was untouched, the snow fresh and pristine. But as I stepped deeper into the woods, I saw them tracks, leading away from the main path and into the trees. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, the shape strange. At first glance, they looked like boot prints, but they were oddly elongated, with claw-like marks at the tips. I stopped and stared at them for a moment, my breath fogging the cold air. I'd never seen anything like them. The prints were fresh. Whoever or whatever had made them couldn't be far. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started to follow them, my boots crunching softly in the snow. The forest felt different as I walked, quieter somehow, as though the trees were holding back a secret. The tracks led me deeper, away from the familiar paths. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The snow here was untouched, except for the trail in front of me. The air grew colder the further I went, the kind of cold that seeped into your skin and settled deep in your chest. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept going, telling myself I'd only follow the tracks a little longer. But the tracks didn't stop. They wound through the trees in a meandering pattern, as though whatever made them had no destination in mind. After what felt like an hour, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest looked unfamiliar, the trees more gnarled and foreboding. The unease crept in slowly, like frost forming on glass. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The tracks ahead of me seemed deliberate, as if they were leading me somewhere. I almost turned back. Almost. But then I noticed something ahead, a clearing, faintly visible through the trees. The tracks led straight toward it. I stepped into the clearing, and my heart sank. The snow here was disturbed, churned up as though something had been pacing back and forth. The tracks circled a large area in the middle of the clearing, where the snow had been flattened completely, as though something heavy had been sitting there. But there was no sign of what had made the tracks. The air felt heavier here, pressing down on me like a weight. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, but the forest was empty. That's when I realized the tracks weren't leading away from the clearing. They stopped abruptly, at the center, disappearing into the flattened snow. I crouched down, trying to make sense of it. The tracks ended, but there was no sign of anything, leaving no more prints, no drag marks. It was as if whatever had been here had simply vanished. The stillness of the clearing became oppressive, the silence too loud. I stood up, my breath clouding in the frigid air. I needed to leave. I turned back toward the trail I'd made, ready to retrace my steps, but my boots froze mid-step. There, at the edge of the clearing, was something watching me. Its shape was hard to define, its pale body blending almost perfectly with the snow. It stood unnaturally still, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. My stomach churned as I realized I couldn't see its face, only dark hollows where eyes should have been, staring straight at me. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground. My breath caught in my throat. The thing didn't move either. but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The air felt colder, the forest darker, as though the thing was sucking the life out of the world around it. Then it took a step forward. The movement was subtle, almost graceful, but it broke the spell. My body kicked into survival mode, and I turned and ran. My boots slipped on the snow as I sprinted back the way I had come, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't, but I could hear it, the faint crunch of snow behind me, steady and deliberate, as though it wasn't rushing but still gaining on me. The forest felt endless. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare. The sound of the footsteps behind me never grew louder, but they didn't fade either. Like the thing was toying with me, letting me believe I had a chance. Finally, I saw at the edge of the woods, the faint outline of my house in the distance. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The moment I broke through the tree line, footsteps stopped. I collapsed in the snow just a few feet from my back door, my body trembling. I forced myself to look back, expecting to see it standing there at the edge of the forest. But there was nothing. The woods were silent and still, the snow undisturbed except for my own tracks. My chest heaved as I scrambled to my feet and rushed inside, locking the door behind me. For hours, I sat by the window, staring at the forest. I told myself it was over, that whatever had been out there wasn't coming back. But deep down, I knew the truth. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the faint crunch of snow, just outside my window. The frozen lake was beautiful, a perfect stretch of white and silver shimmering under the pale winter sun. It appeared suddenly, tucked away in a clearing I hadn't known existed, hidden deep within the forest. I didn't mean to find it. I'd only been exploring near my cabin, wandering further than I ever had before. When I stepped into the clearing and saw the lake, stopped dead in my tracks. The air was colder here, sharper, and the silence was unlike anything I'd experienced. No wind, no rustling trees, just stillness. The lake was so smooth it could have been a mirror, unbroken by even a crack or blemish. Something about it felt untouched, perfect, too perfect. I don't know why I didn't turn back right then. Curiosity tugged at me as I approached the shoreline. My boots crunched on the icy snow, but the sound felt muffled, swallowed by the heavy quiet. The ice was clear near the edge, revealing a deep, dark blue beneath the surface. It didn't feel like a normal lake. It felt alive. Kneeling down, I reached out to touch the ice. The moment my fingertips brushed it, a shiver ran through my entire body. Not the kind of shiver you get from the cold. This was deeper, sharper, like something had reached inside me. I pulled my hand back quickly, my breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. That's when I noticed the marks. They were faint, almost invisible beneath the surface of the ice. But as I leaned closer, I saw them clearly, scratch marks. Long, deep gouges that ran in jagged lines, crisscrossing like the frantic movements of something trapped. My stomach twisted, and I took a step back. The marks didn't make sense. No animal could have left them, not from below. And yet, they were there, etched into the frozen surface like scars. I should have walked away. I should have left the lake, and never looked back. But something about it drew me in, a pull I couldn't resist. My feet moved on their own, carrying me onto the ice. It was solid beneath me, holding my weight easily, but each step felt heavier, like the lake didn't want me to leave. I walked to the center, where the ice was darker, almost black. The cold seemed stronger there, biting at my skin even through my thick jacket. The silence pressed down on me, and my breathing sounded too loud, too intrusive. I stared down at the ice, at the shadows that swirled beneath it, darker than the depths of any lake I'd ever seen. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, some trick of the light, but as I stared, it began to take shape. A face, pale and distorted, pressed against the underside of the ice. Its eyes were wide and empty, its mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the face didn't move. It just stared, unblinking. The ice beneath me groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through my bones. I turned to run, but my boots slid on the slick surface, and I fell hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. When I looked up, the face was gone, but something else was there. Beneath the ice, shapes moved dark, sinuous shapes that twisted and writhed like shadows, come to life. They didn't have a form I could understand, but their movement was deliberate, purposeful. They circled beneath me, closer and closer, until I felt like the ice might give way beneath my weight. I scrambled to my feet, my hands and knees stinging from the cold, and ran. The ice groaned, louder with each step, the sound chasing me to the edge of the lake. I didn't stop until I reached the snow-covered ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned back, expecting to see cracks spiderwebbing across the surface, but the lake was as smooth and perfect as it had been when I arrived. The shapes were gone. The face was gone. It was as though nothing had happened. I told myself to leave, to forget about the lake, but my feet didn't move. I couldn't look away. The silence of the clearing was louder now, more oppressive, and the air seemed colder with each passing second. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely more than a whisper, coming from the center of the lake. It wasn't the groan of ice or the howl of wind, it was a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It called my third name. My blood turned to ice. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It sounded like me. I took a step back, then another, my boots crunching on the snow. The voice grew louder, more insistent, repeating my name over and over. It wasn't just coming from the lake, no, it was inside my head, echoing like 1,000 voices speaking at once. The edge of the lake seemed to blur, the trees around the clearing fading into a white haze. My vision swam, and the ground beneath me felt unsteady, as the were pulling me back. I stumbled and fell into the snow, my hands sinking into its icy depths. When I looked up, the lake wasn't empty anymore. Figures stood on the ice, dozens of them, their shapes pale and indistinct. They didn't move, didn't breathe, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The voice in my head stopped, replaced by a sound that chilled me to my Korea low, guttural growl, coming from deep beneath the ice. The figures on the lake began to shift, their heads tilting in unison, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. Then they turned, all at once, and began to walk toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my legs burning as I pushed through the snow. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was safe inside my cabin. The door locked and bolted behind me. I haven't gone back to the lake. I've tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But every night, I dream of those figures standing on the ice, their pale shapes motionless, their empty eyes staring at me. And in every dream, the growl gets louder. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere, a sudden blinding force that swallowed the world in white. One moment, I was walking back to the cabin under a gray, overcast sky. The next, I was surrounded by howling wind and swirling snow. The forest path I'd been following was gone, buried under the storm's fury. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my face, squinting against the wind. The cold stung my skin like needles, and my breath came in short, visible gasps. The cabin wasn't fairer, at least, it shouldn't have been, but the storm turned everything unfamiliar, twisting the landscape into an endless blur of snow and shadows. Panic began to creep in as I realized I didn't know which direction to go. My phone was useless, the signal long gone, and the battery too low to risk wasting it on the flashlight. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. Then, through the howling wind, I heard it. A voice, soft, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. It cut through the storm like a thread of sound, winding its way into my ears. At first, I thought it was my imagination, some trick of the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. Over here. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was calm, soothing, almost warm, the kind of voice you Sefterdes wanted to trust. It sounded close, too close for comfort. I froze in place, my heart pounding, and strained to see through the swirling snow. "Follow me," it said, coaxing, gentle. A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but something in the back of my mind warned me to stay silent. My breath hitched as I scanned the empty expanse around me. No one was there. No tracks, no figures, just the storm. The voice came again, insistent. "This way." Against my better judgment, I moved toward the sound. I didn't have much choice standing. Still, in a storm like this would only get me killed. The snow beneath my boots crunched with every step, the wind screaming louder as if trying to drown out the voice. I followed it blindly, my hands trembling in the cold. The voice led me deeper into the storm, away from the direction I thought the cabin should be. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but the voice had a pull I couldn't resist. It felt like it was burrowing into my mind, wrapping itself around my thoughts. "Almost there," it murmured, so close now that I felt like I could reach out and touch the speaker. That's when I saw a faint light flickering in the distance, barely visible through the snow. Relief surged through me, and I stumbled toward it, my legs weak from the cold and exhaustion. The voice urged me on, its tone growing warmer, more welcoming. But as I drew closer, the light didn't feel right. It wasn't steady like the glow of a fire or a flashlight. It pulsed, shifting in color, casting strange shadows on the snow. The closer I got, the more the unease in my chest grew. Finally, I reached the source of the light. It was a lantern, hanging from the twisted branch of a tree. The light was unnatural, a cold, bluish glow that didn't seem to illuminate anything around it. The tree itself was wrong. Its bark, blackened and cracked, its branches bare despite the snow piling around its roots. I stopped in my tracks, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn and run. But the voice spoke again, softer now. "You've found it." A shape emerged from the snow just beyond the lantern's glow. My breath caught as I realized it was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its body pale and smooth like carved ice. Its head tilted as it regarded me, its face featureless, except for two dark hollows where eyes should have been. Again, but this time it wasn't soft or coaxing. It was cold and hollow, echoing inside my mind. "Come closer." My legs trembled, my body refusing to obey as the thing reached out a long, spindly arm. Its fingers stretched impossibly far, claw-like and sharp, as they brushed the edge of the lantern's light. The snow around it didn't melt. It seemed to darken, sinking into shadows that crawled across the ground. I stepped back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing didn't follow. It simply stood there, waiting. "Stay with me," it whispered, the words dripping with malice. I turned and ran. The storm seemed to fight against me, the wind pushing me back as I stumbled through the snow. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. The voice grew louder. Behind me, harsher, its tone no longer inviting but furious. "Don't leave," it snarled, the sound like ice splintering. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, clawing at my heels as I pushed forward. My vision blurred, my body numb, but somehow I kept going. When I finally saw the faint outline of the cabin through the storm, relief flooded me. I threw myself against the door, fumbling with the handle before collapsing inside. The warmth of the fire hit me like a wave, and I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. For a long time I just sat there, shivering, staring at the door. The voice didn't follow me inside. The storm outside howled and raged, but it felt distant now, as though the forest itself had retreated. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The lantern's blue light burned in my mind, and every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Even now, I can still hear it sometimes, calling to me from the woods. "Come closer." It was on the third day of the storm that I found the lantern. The wind had turned savage, roaring through the forest and whipping the snow into blinding white walls. I'd only gone outside to check on the generator, which was struggling to keep the Cabin warm. The cold was relentless, seeping through every crack and crevice, no matter how many layers I wore, or how close I sat to the fire. The forest was unrecognizable in the storm. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. My footsteps crunched loudly in the frozen stillness. As I trudged toward the small shed where the generator sat, the air felt sharp, each breath burning my lungs. That's when I saw a faint blue light flickering through the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the storm, the wind refracting the last rays of the setting sun. But the light moved, steady and deliberate, bobbing gently like a flame carried on the breeze. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, unsure if I was seeing things. The light grew brighter, its glow casting an eerie hue on the snow. I should have turned back, gone straight to the cabin and locked the door. But something about the light pulled me in. It felt familiar, like it was waiting for me. I stepped off the path, my boots sinking into the deep snow. As I followed the glow, the light didn't retreat, it hovered just ahead, always within reach but never close enough to touch. My pulse quickened, and the bitter cold faded from my mind as I pushed deeper into the woods. Finally, I reached it. The lantern hung from a low branch, its flame an unnatural shade of blue. The light flickered, softly, casting strange, shifting shadows on the snow. The lantern itself was old, its brass frame tarnished and etched with frost. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten and untouched. But the flame inside burned strong. I hesitated, my breath clouding the icy air as I stared at it. The cold was worse here, biting at my exposed skin and making my fingers ache. But I couldn't look away. The lantern felt alive, its light pulsing faintly, almost like it was breathing. I reached out, my gloved hand trembling, and touched the lantern's handle. Freezing, colder than anything I'd ever felt. But I couldn't let go. The moment my fingers wrapped around the handle, a wave of warmth flooded through me, warmth that wasn't comforting, but suffocating, like stepping too close to a wire. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. It spoke words I couldn't understand, a language I'd never heard, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling to me. "Come closer," it said, "see?" The warmth grew stronger, spreading through my body even as the air around me remained frigid. I lifted the lantern from the branch, its light spilling over the snow and illuminating the shadows beneath the trees. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, the wind dying down to a low murmur. The snow beneath my feet shifted, and I froze. Slowly, I looked down. The ground wasn't solid. The snow-covered surface was thin, fragile, and beneath it was ice, clear and glassy, like a frozen window. Through it, I saw something moving. Dark shapes twisted and writhed just beneath the surface, their forms indistinct but unnerving. They didn't move like animals or people. They moved like shadows, flowing and shifting, without rhyme or reason. My stomach churned, and I took a step back, the lantern trembling in my hand. The voice came again, louder this time. "Look!" Against my better judgment, I knelt, holding the lantern closer to the ice. Its blue flame illuminated the shapes below, and I saw them more clearly. Faces, pale, distorted faces pressed against the underside of the ice, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were dark voids, staring up at me, pleading. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The ice groaned beneath my weight, a low, resonant sound that sent shivers through me. The faces didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, their empty eyes following me as I backed away. The lantern's light flickered, and the voice grew sharper. "Stay." I turned to run, but the ground beneath me cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading through the ice. The faces beneath twisted and writhed, their mouths moving soundlessly. The lantern's warmth turned searing, burning against my gloved hand, but I couldn't drop it. It felt fused to my caney skin. The shadows beneath the ice began to rise, pressing against the surface like they were trying to break through. The groaning grew louder, almost deafening. as the fractures widened. Panic gripped me, and I ran, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. The forest felt endless, the trees blurring together in the storm. The wind returned, howling with renewed fury, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The groaning ice echoed in my ears, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes on my back. When I finally stumbled back onto the cabin's porch, I collapsed, my chest heaving. The lantern's flame still burned, its blue light casting eerie shadows on walls. I hurled it into the snow, but the flame didn't go out. It sat there, flickering softly, as though mocking me. I haven't touched the lantern since. It's still out there, just beyond the cabin, burning in the bitter cold. The storm has passed, but the voices haven't. I hear them at night, faint whispers calling my name, urging me to come back. And sometimes when I look out the window, I see them, the faces in the snow, watching, waiting. The first time it happened, I thought I was imagining things. It was late, and the lights in the cabin cast long shadows across the wooden floor. I had been pacing in front of the fireplace, trying to shake off the chill that seemed to cling to me no matter how high I turned up the heat. When I finally stopped to sit down, I saw it, my shadow, stretched out before me, darker and sharper than the flickering firelight should have allowed. And it moved. Just a flicker at first, barely perceptible, like a twitch of the hand. But I was standing still, frozen, in place, my heart thundering in my chest. I stared at it, waiting for the movement to happen, again, but the shadow lay still, perfectly mirroring my posture. I told myself it was nothing. Shadows shift with the light, I thought. I was just tired. My eyes were playing tricks on me, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, the shadow began to change. At first, it was subtle little things that were easy to dismiss. I'd catch it moving out of the corner of my eye when I wasn't moving. Its edges seemed to ripple, like smoke caught in a breeze. Once, I swore I saw it linger behind me when I turned a corner, as if it needed an extra moment to catch up. I avoided looking directly at it after that. It was easier to pretend everything was fine, to tell myself I was imagining things. But at night, when the cabin was quiet, and the only light came from the flickering fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The shadows stretched long and dark across the floor, more solid than a shadow should be. It felt alive, like it had weight and substance. When I moved, it followed, but not perfectly. Sometimes, it would hesitate, its movements lagging behind mine. Other times, it moved too quickly, as though anticipating my actions. I started leaving the lights off, hoping the darkness would erase it. But even in the dim glow of the fire, I could feel it there, lurking just out of sight. The breaking point came one night when the storm outside was at its worst. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the snow fell in heavy sheets, muffling all sound. I had been reading by the fire, trying to distract myself, when the room grew unbearably cold. The flames in the fireplace flickered, as though struggling against an unseen force. I looked down and saw it. My shadow wasn't lying flat on the floor anymore. It was standing, its shape distorted and wrong, rising up behind me like a second figure. The sight of it froze me in place, my book slipping from my hands. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to move. The shadow stretched taller, its edges rippling like water, its head tilted, mimicking a motion I hadn't made, and its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides. Then it took a step forward. I didn't move. I couldn't. But the shadow moved again, its foot falling silently onto the floorboards. It didn't follow my movements anymore. It had broken free. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I watched the shadow circle around me, its dark, featureless form somehow more menacing than anything I could have imagined. It stopped in front of me, towering over where I sat frozen on the couch. Then it knelt. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though it was studying me. Its head tilted again, and, though it had no face, I could feel its gaze boring into me. My skin prickled, and the air felt sharp like needles pressing into my lungs. It raised a hand. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut, but I couldn't block out the sensation of cold fingers brushing against my face. It didn't feel like a touch, it felt like emptiness. A void that sucked all warmth from my skin. My eyes snapped open, and the shadow was gone. But the room wasn't empty. I could feel it now, a presence that lingered just beyond the edges of the firelight. It didn't stay confined to my shadow anymore. It moved freely, slipping through the dark corners of the room, always just out of sight. I could hear it sometimes, the soft creak of floorboards, the faint rustle of air. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it hovering near me, its weight pressing down on the room. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of darkness, of a shadow that wasn't mine, pulling me down into a cold, endless void. When I woke, the fire had gone out, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the matches, my hands trembling, but as the flame flickered to life, I saw it. The shadow wasn't on the floor anymore. It was on the wall, standing right, its shape distorted, and shifting like smoke. It didn't move as I stared at it, but I felt its attention fixed on me. And then, it stepped forward, peeling itself from the wall like it was shedding skin. I don't remember much after that. I ran, stumbling through the cabin, my breaths ragged, panicked. The shadow followed, its movements silent and predatory, growing larger and darker with each passing second. I barely made it out the door, the ice air hitting me like a slap as I fled into the snowstorm. I haven't gone back to the cabin. I don't know if I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my room, just a flicker, a ripple, a shadow that doesn't belong. And every time I see it, I wonder if it's waiting for me to stop running. It wasn't much, just a slight tilt, like something was pressing up from below. But it was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I threw the blanket off and leapt to my feet, the icy floor biting at my bare skin. The cold was unbearable now, sinking deep into my bones, but I didn't stop. I stumbled toward the door, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Behind me, the bed groaned, the sound of splintering ice reaching a fever pitch. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The ice beneath the bed was gone, replaced by a gaping void. The shapes that had been beneath the surface were no longer trapped, they were climbing out. Their pale, misshapen forms, twisted unnaturally, their limbs too long, and their movements jerky, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. One of them turned its head toward me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. It reached out, its hand impossibly long, its fingers tipped with jagged claws of ice. The sound that came from its mouth wasn't a scream or a growl, it was a deep, resonant cracking, like the ice itself was speaking. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I threw open the door and ran into the hallway, my feet slipping on the frost-covered floor. The cold followed me, the air growing heavier with each step. The walls groaned, and I could hear the sound of ice spreading, snapping, as though the entire cabin was freezing from the inside out. By the time I reached the front door, my fingers were numb, and my vision was starting to blur. Fumbled with the lock, my hands trembling, and finally managed to wrench the door open. Storm outside was blinding, the snow swirling in thick, suffocating waves, but it was better than what was behind me. I stumbled out into the snow, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I ran. The wind howled around me, stinging my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sound of cracking ice echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I collapsed in the snow, my body trembling from exhaustion and cold. The cabin was gone, swallowed by the storm, but I could still hear the sound of ice cracking, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't just coming from the cabin anymore, it was all around me, beneath the breath, snow, beneath the earth itself. The ground shifted, and I realized with growing horror that the ice wasn't gone. It had followed me, and it was waiting. The warmth grew stronger, spreading through my body even as the air around me remained frigid. I lifted the lantern from the branch, its light spilling over the snow and illuminating the shadows beneath the trees. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, the wind dying down to a low murmur. The snow beneath my feet shifted, and I froze. Slowly, I looked down. The ground wasn't solid. The snow-covered surface was thin, fragile, and beneath it was ice, clear and glassy like a frozen window. Through it, I saw something moving. Dark shapes twisted and writhed just beneath the surface, their forms indistinct but unnerving. They didn't move like animals or people. They moved like shadows, flowing and shifting, without rhyme or reason. My stomach churned, and I took a step back. The lantern trembling in was my hand. The voice came again, louder this time. Look. Against my better judgment, I knelt, holding the lantern closer to the ice. Its blue flame illuminated the shapes below, and I saw them more clearly. Faces, pale, distorted faces pressed against the underside of the ice, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were dark voids, staring up at me, pleading. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The ice groaned beneath my weight. A low, resonant sound sent shivers through me. The faces didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. Their empty eyes following me as I backed away. The lantern's light flickered, and the voice grew sharper. Stay. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading through the ice. The faces beneath twisted and writhed, their mouths moving soundlessly. The lantern's warmth turned searing, burning against my gloved hand, but I couldn't drop it. It felt fused to my skin. The shadows beneath the ice began to rise, pressing against the surface like they were trying to break through. The groaning grew louder, almost deafening, as the fractures widened. Panic gripped me, and I ran, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. The forest felt endless, the trees blurring together in the storm. The wind returned, howling with renewed fury, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The groaning ice echoed in my ears, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes on my back. When I finally stumbled back onto the cabin's porch, I collapsed, my chest heaving. Lantern's flame still burned, its blue light casting eerie shadows on walls. I hurled it into the snow, but the flame didn't go out. It sat there, flickering softly, as though mocking me. I haven't touched the lantern since. It's still out there, just beyond the cabin, burning in the bitter cold. The storm has passed, but the voices haven't. I hear them at night, faint whispers calling my name, urging me to come back. And sometimes, when I look out the window, I see them, the faces in the snow, watching, waiting. The snowstorm had driven me far off course, forcing me deeper into the wilderness than I ever intended to go. For hours, I wandered through the endless white, the wind howling, and the snow stinging my face. My legs ached, my body was numb, and my mind teetered on the edge of panic. But then I saw it. The village. It appeared like a mirage through the swirling snow, a cluster of dark shapes huddled against the horizon. Buildings, squat and simple, their rooftops laden with thick piles of snow. Smoke didn't rise from the chimneys, and no lights shone through the frost-covered windows. But it was shelter, a place to rest, somewhere out of the storm. I stumbled toward it, my boots crunching through the deep snow, my breath ragged. As I drew closer, a strange sense of unease settled over me. The village was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive. The wind seemed to quiet as I approached, as though the storm itself was reluctant to touch this place. The first building I passed was a small house. Its windows were shattered, the glass covered in frost, and the door hung slightly ajar. Snow had piled up against the frame, spilling inside. Peered through the opening, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice echoed faintly, but no one answered. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the icy floor. The house small and sparse, just a single room with a table, a chair, and a bed shoved against the far wall. Everything was coated in or a thin layer of frost, as though the cold had seeped into every crack and crevice. The air inside was frigid, colder than the storm outside. The unease grew stronger, prickling at the back of my neck. I turned to leave, but before I stepped out, I noticed something on the floor near the table, a pair of boots. They were small, like they belonged to a child, but they weren't covered in frost like everything else. They were perfectly clean, sitting neatly side by side. My stomach churned, and I quickly left the house, the cold air outside feeling strangely warmer than the interior. I moved further into the village, passing more buildings. Each one was dark, abandoned, with doors hanging open or windows smashed. Yet nothing looked touched by time or decay. There were no signs of life, but no signs of struggle either. It was as if the villagers had simply vanished. I stopped in the center of the village, where a fountain sat buried under snow. The statue in its center was weathered and cracked. The features of whatever figure it had once depicted long, eroded. I turned slowly, scanning the empty streets. The silence was deafening. And then I saw the tracks. Footprints, faint and partially buried under the falling snow. They led away from the fountain, winding down a narrow alley between two houses. My heart pounded as I followed them, my breath fogging in the air. The tracks were strange, too deep, too long, like something heavy had trudged through the snow on unsteady legs. The footprints stopped at the entrance to a larger building near the edge of the village. It was a church, its steeple towering over the other buildings, though the cross at its peak was crooked, leaning dangerously to one side. The heavy wooden doors were closed, frost clinging to the edges like vines. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place. But my feet moved on, their own. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the cold was unbearable. The air was thick, heavy, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. The pews were intact but covered in a fine layer of snow, as though the storm had seeped inside. At the far end of the room, the altar stood shrouded in shadow, and a single candle burned on its surface, its flame flickering with an unnatural blue light. That's when I saw them, figures sitting in the pews, their heads bowed as if in prayer. My chest tightened, and my breath caught in my throat. There were at least a dozen of them, their forms still and silent. Their clothes were old, tattered, and their skin was pale, almost translucent. Frost clung to their faces, and hair, their eyes closed. I stepped closer, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. Something about them wasn't right. Their skin wasn't just pale, it was wrong, like the ice itself had fused with their flesh. Their hands rested in their laps, fingers unnaturally long and thin, tipped with sharp, blackened nails. One of them moved. The sound of cracking ice filled the room as the figure's head turned slowly, its movements stiff and unnatural. Its eyes opened, dark, empty, and its mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, if not for the jagged shards of ice that lined its gums. I stumbled back, my body trembling. The candle's flame flickered violently, casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls. One by one, the other figures began to stir, their heads turning in unison, their hollow eyes locking onto me. The air grew heavier, colder, and the frost on the walls began to spread, creeping toward me. Sound of ice cracking and splintering filled the room as the figures rose from their pews, their movements slow and deliberate. Their smiles widened, and the sound that escaped their mouths wasn't a scream or a growl, it was a deep, resonant hum, like the groaning of a frozen lake. I ran. The church doors slammed shut behind me as I stumbled into the snow. The storm was still raging, but the wind felt warmer than the air inside that cursed building. I didn't stop running until I was out of the village, my legs burning and my lungs screaming for air. I didn't look back. I don't know what happened to the people of that village, or what those things in the church were. All I know is that the cold hasn't left me. No matter how many fires I light, no matter how many blankets I pile on, I can still feel it in my bones. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the hum, low and deep, resonating through the walls, calling me back. The snowstorm had come and gone, leaving behind a pristine, blindingly white landscape that seemed untouched by anything living. I had wandered deeper into the woods than usual, drawn by the eerie stillness that followed the storm. The air was crisp and silent, save for the soft crunch of my boots on the snow. That's when I saw something glinting faintly in the distance, catching the pale light of the winter sun. At first I thought it was just ice, a trick of the light reflecting off a frozen branch. But as I moved closer, the shape grew clearer, unnatural in its sharpness. It was too perfect, too smooth to belong in the forest. It was a mirror. It stood upright in the snow, its frame ornate and blackened with age, its surface pristine and polished. There were no tracks around it, no sign of anyone who could have placed it there. It simply stood alone, as if it had grown out of the ground itself. The sight of it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I approached cautiously, my breath fogging in the icy air. My reflection came into view as I drew closer, distorted slightly by the uneven light, but unmistakably me. I reached out, hesitant, and my fingers brushed the edge of the frame. The metal was cold, far colder than it should have been, and I snatched my hand back, instinctively. That's when the reflection changed. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker, a ripple across the surface, like the mirror's image was made of water. Then it solidified, and the scene before me wasn't the snowy forest anymore. It was my cabin. I stared, my heart pounding. The reflection showed me inside the cabin, sitting by the fire, a blanket draped over my shoulders. It was so vivid, so real, that I could almost feel the warmth of the flames. But something was wrong. My reflection wasn't looking at the fire, it was looking at me. I stepped back, my breath quickening, and the image shifted again. The cabin disappeared, replaced by darkness. And then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from the void, indistinct at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. It was me again. But this time, I wasn't alone. I stood in the middle of the forest, surrounded by shadows that twisted and writhed like smoke. They moved closer, circling me, their forms becoming sharper. Faces emerged from the darkness veil, hollow-eyed, with mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. My reflection didn't move, didn't run. It just stood there, staring straight ahead as the shadows closed in. I stumbled back, the snow crunching beneath my boots, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figures reached for my reflection, their long, claw-like hands stretching out, and then, in perfect unison, they turned their heads to look at me. The surface of the mirror rippled violently, and the reflection disappeared, replaced once again by my own face. But now, the forest behind me in the reflection wasn't the one I was standing in. It was darker, colder, the trees gnarled and lifeless. The snow beneath me was blackened, as though it had been burned. And then, my reflection smiled. It was a slow, deliberate motion, and it wasn't my smile. It was too wide, too sharp, the edges of it curling unnaturally. My stomach twisted, and I took another step back, nearly losing my footing on the icy ground. The mirror shimmered again, and a new image appeared. This time it showed me walking through the woods, my face pale and my eyes hollow. My steps were slow, dragging, like I was being pulled by something I couldn't resist. I watched as the reflection me stopped in front of the same mirror, staring into it, but instead of showing the forest behind me, the mirror in the reflection was filled with darkness. And then, dozens of them reached out from the mirror, grabbing the reflection me and pulling me inside. My reflection didn't fight, didn't scream. It just let them take me, disappearing into the void. The mirror's surface rippled one final time before going still. My own face stared back at me, now pale and trembling. The snow around the mirror was undisturbed, but I could feel something beneath it, waiting, watching. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at my reflection. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. The forest was silent, the wind gone, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, I turned and walked away, my legs unsteady and my mind racing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I heard the faint sounding ice, sharp and deliberate, echoing from behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't dare. I made it back to the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The storm returned that night, fiercer than before, burying the forest in snow once again. But no matter how many logs I added to the fire, I couldn't shake the cold that had settled into my bones. And sometimes, when the wind dies down and the night is still, I swear I can hear whispers, faint and far away, carried on the icy breeze. They sound like my own voice, and they're calling me back. The river had always been a place of peace for me. In the summer, its gentle current sparkled in the sunlight, and the air was filled with the sounds of rushing water and chirping birds. But in the dead of winter, it transformed into something else, entirely a silent, frozen expanse that stretched like a scar across the landscape. That's where I found myself that day, bundled against the biting cold, the snow crunching beneath my boots as I walked along the riverbank. The storm from the night before had cleared, leaving the world eerily still. The frozen river gleamed under the pale gray sky, its surface smooth and glossy. The forest surrounding it seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. I stopped at a familiar bend in the river where the ice was thickest. The water had frozen in layers, trapping air bubbles and fragments of snow within its crystalline depths. I leaned down to peer into the ice, curious to see what patterns nature had left behind this time. But what I saw wasn't natural. Beneath the surface, faint but unmistakable, was a face. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the ice, the way the bubbles and cracks formed could sometimes resemble shapes. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. It was a face, pale and distorted, its eyes wide and empty, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crouched down again, staring at the face trapped beneath the ice. It didn't move, didn't blink, but it was there, clear as day. Then I noticed the others. There were more faces, scattered along the length of the frozen river. Some were faint and blurry, little more than suggestions of features, while others were vivid, their expressions twisted in fear or agony. I counted at least a dozen, their hollow eyes staring up at me from the icy depths. A chill crawled up my spine, and I stepped back, my boots slipping on the frozen ground. Breath hung in the air, each exhale sharp and uneven. The forest seemed darker now, the silence heavier, as though the world itself had shifted. I told myself to leave, to turn around, and go back to the safety of the cabin. But something about the faces held me in place, their lifeless gazes drawing me closer. My feet moved on their own, carrying me out onto the frozen river despite the faint groans of the ice beneath my weight. I knelt down, placing a trembling hand on the surface of the ice. It was colder than it should have been, the chill biting through my gloves and sinking into my skin. The faces beneath the ice seemed to shift slightly, their features blurring and twisting as though the ice was alive, reshaping them. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost too soft to notice, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from the forest or the sky, it was coming from beneath the ice. I pressed my ear closer, straining to hear, and the sound grew louder. Voices, dozens of them, overlapping and echoing, their words too faint and jumbled to make sense. Tone, though, was unmistakable pleading, desperate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. The voices were coming from the faces in the ice. I scrambled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The ice groaned beneath me, sound sharp and threatening, and for a moment, I thought it might crack. I turned to run back to the shore, but as I did, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Help us." The words froze me in place. They were clear now, spoken in a voice that didn't sound like it belonged to any one person, but to all the faces beneath the ice. I stared down, and the faces stared back, their empty eyes locked onto mine. "Please." The ice beneath my feet groaned again, louder this time, and I felt it shift slightly. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, slipping and sliding across the frozen surface. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more frantic. Don't leave us. The shore felt impossibly far, the forest on the other side dark and unwelcome. My legs burned as I pushed myself forward, the cold air slicing through my lungs. The voices rose into a cacophony, filling my head, drowning out the sound of my boots on the ice. Come back. I reached the edge of the river and collapsed onto the snow, my chest heaving. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. I turned back to the frozen river, expecting to see the faces staring up at me, but the ice was empty. The smooth, glassy surface stretched out, unbroken, reflecting the gray sky above. The faces were gone, as if they'd never been there at all. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I staggered, to my feet, my legs trembling. I didn't look back as I fled into the forest, the snow crunching loudly underfoot. The air felt heavier, colder, the shadows deeper. Even when I reached the safety of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I dreamed of the river. I dreamed of the faces beneath the ice, their hollow eyes, staring up at me, their mouths opening to scream. When I woke, my window was frosted over, and the air inside the cabin was freezing. The faint sound of cracking ice echoed in my ears, and I swear I heard the whisper again, "Help us." The snow was fresh, untouched except for the faint trail of red that cut across it like a scar. It wasn't much, just drops at first, scattered and uneven, but it was enough to make me stop, enough to make my stomach twist in knots. I'd been out hiking, trying to take advantage of the clear skies after the storm. The forest was beautiful in winter, silent and serene, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the only person in the world. But now, staring at the crimson stain against the snow, that silence felt oppressive. Wrong. My first thought was that it might be an injured animal, a deer, maybe, or a fox. But the trail was too strange for that. The drops weren't random. They formed a deliberate path, leading deeper into the woods. I hesitated, the cold biting at my face, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed it. The trail grew thicker as I went, the drops becoming smears, then streaks. The snow was disturbed here, as though something heavy had been dragged through it. The forest around me felt darker, the trees closer together, their skeletal branches reaching overhead like claws. The further I went, the quieter it became. The crunch of my boots on the snow seemed unnaturally loud, the only sound in a world that felt suddenly devoid of life. No birds, no wind, just the rhythmic pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. The trail led me to a clearing, and I froze. In the center of the clearing was a large patch of crimson-stained snow, the trail ending abruptly at its edge. The scene was chaotic, tufts of fur, scattered, deep gouges in the frozen ground. At first, I thought it was an animal kill, the remains of a predator's feast. But there was no carcass, no bloodied remains, just the strange marks in the snow and the overwhelming sense that I was not alone. I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the icy air. My foot hit something buried beneath the snow, a bone, small and jagged, but not the kind of bone I'd expect from a deer or rabbit. It was too clean, too precise, like it had been stripped bare. A low groan echoed through the clearing, and I spun around, my pulse racing. The sound wasn't human, nor was it an animal. It was deep and resonant, like the earth itself was crying out. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching longer, darker. Then I saw it. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, something moved. At first, it was just a in shape, a dark silhouette against the white snow. But as it came closer, I saw it more clearly, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't human. It walked on two legs, but its movements were wrong, jerky, almost mechanical. Its body was too thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The skin, if you could call it that, was pale and mottled, like flesh that had been frozen and thawed too many times. Its eyes, black and sunken, locked onto mine, and I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move. It was a slow, deliberate motion, and it wasn't my smile. It was too wide, too sharp, the edges of it curling unnaturally. My stomach twisted, and I took another step back, nearly losing my footing on the icy ground. The mirror shimmered again, and a new image appeared. This time it showed me walking through the woods, my face pale and my eyes hollow. My steps were slow, dragging, like I was being pulled by something I couldn't resist. I watched as the reflection me stopped in front of the same mirror, staring into it, but instead of showing the forest behind me, the mirror in the reflection was filled with darkness. And then, dozens of them reached out from the mirror, grabbing the reflection me and pulling me inside. My reflection didn't fight, didn't scream. It just let them take me, disappearing into the void. The mirror's surface rippled one final time before going still. My own face stared back at me, now pale and trembling. The snow around the mirror was undisturbed, but I could feel something beneath it, waiting, watching. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at my reflection. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. The forest was silent, the wind gone, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, I turned and walked away, my legs unsteady and my mind racing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I heard the faint sounding ice, sharp and deliberate, echoing from behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't dare. I made it back to the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The storm returned that night, fiercer than before, burying the forest in snow once again. But no matter how many logs I added to the fire, I couldn't shake the cold that had settled into my bones. And sometimes, when the wind dies down and the night is still, I swear I can hear whispers, faint and far away, carried on the icy breeze. They sound like my own voice, and they're calling me back. The cabin wasn't supposed to be there. I had been hiking for hours, following a trail marked on the map. The snowstorm came suddenly, swallowing the landscape in a flurry of white. The wind howled through the trees, carrying icy flakes that stung my face. I thought I was prepared for winter hiking, but as the storm grew worse, I realized I'd made a mistake. My gear wasn't enough, and I needed shelter before nightfall. That's when I saw it. A cabin stood at the edge of the trail, tucked between two towering pines. Its roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and its windows were dark, but it looked sturdy enough. Relief washed over me as I hurried toward it, my boots crunching through the deep snow. The cabin wasn't marked on my map, but I didn't care. It was shelter, and that was all that mattered. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was frigid, but at least it was dry. The cabin was sparse, just a small room with a wood stove, a table, and a single chair. A narrow bed sat against the far wall, its mattress sagging under a threadbare blanket. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The storm's roar was muffled, the walls thick enough to block out most of the wind. But the quiet felt unnatural, heavy, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I set my pack down and explored cautiously. There was no sign of anyone living here, no food, no personal belongings, nothing to suggest who might have built it. The wood stove was cold, but there was a pile of firewood in the corner. I set to work lighting a fire, grateful for the warmth that slowly filled the room. As the storm raged outside, I settled onto the bed, pulling the blanket around me. The mattress was lumpy and uncomfortable, but exhaustion made it bearable. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. I told myself I'd leave at first light. I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was the storm, maybe snow falling from the roof, or branches creaking in, the wind. But as I lay still, holding my breath, I heard it again. Deliberate, heavy steps on the wooden floor. Someone was inside the cabin. My heart raced as I strained to see through the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting faint, flickering shadows across the walls. The footsteps moved slowly, pacing back and forth, but I couldn't see anyone. I sat up, my hands trembling as I reached for my flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, illuminating the empty chair, the empty table, the closed door. No one was there. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, even heavier than before, pressing down on me like a weight. I told myself it was just my imagination, the stress of the storm, and the unfamiliar place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin. The fire flickered weakly, its glow casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my fear, exhaustion eventually pulled me under. The next time I woke, the fire was out. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my bones and making my breath visible. I reached for the flashlight, but my hand froze midair. Someone was sitting in the chair. The figure was barely visible, a dark silhouette against the faint light filtering through the frosted window. They were completely still, their head tilted slightly as though watching me. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, trapped under an invisible weight. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the air in the room grew heavier, colder. I could feel their presence, oppressive and suffocating. Finally, I managed to whisper, "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stood, the motions slow and deliberate, and began to walk toward the bed. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched its shadowy form draw closer, each step impossibly slow, dragging out the moment like a cruel game. And then it stopped. The figure stood at the foot of the bed, its head tilting further, as if examining me. I couldn't see, its face just darkness where features should have been. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows closing in. The figure leaned down, its face inches from mine, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was cold, empty, like the wind howling through an abandoned building. The words sent a chill through me that froze me to the core. Before I could react, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness as though it had never been there. The oppressive silence returned, and I sat frozen, unable to move or breathe. The fire was still out, the air frigid, but the cabin felt even emptier now, as though something vital had been taken from it. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time. I grabbed my pack, threw open the door, and fled into the forest. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine, snow-covered world. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was miles away from the cabin. Later, when I checked my map again, I confirmed what I already knew. The cabin wasn't marked. It wasn't supposed to exist. I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I can still feel its presence, lingering like a shadow at the edges of my mind. I haven't gone hiking since. The thought of stepping into another forest fills me with a dread I can't explain. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear it. "You shouldn't have come here." The snow was fresh, untouched except for the faint trail of red that cut across it like a scar. It wasn't much, just drops at first, scattered and uneven, but it was enough to make me stop, enough to make my stomach twist in knots. I'd been out hiking, trying to take advantage of the clear skies after the storm. The forest was beautiful in winter, silent and serene, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the only person in the world. But now, staring at the crimson stain against the snow, that silence felt oppressive. Wrong. My first thought was that it might be an injured animal, a deer, maybe, or a fox. But the trail was too strange for that. The drops weren't random. They formed a deliberate path, leading deeper into the woods. I hesitated, the cold biting at my face, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed it. The trail grew thicker as I went, the drops becoming smears, then streaks. The snow was disturbed here, as though something heavy had been dragged through it. The forest around me felt darker, the trees closer together, their skeletal branches reaching overhead like claws. The further I went, the quieter it became. The crunch of my boots on the snow seemed unnaturally loud, the only sound in a world that felt suddenly devoid of life. No birds, no wind, just the rhythmic pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. The trail led me to a clearing, and I froze. In the center of the clearing was a large patch of crimson-stained snow, the trail ending abruptly at its edge. The scene was chaotic tufts of fur, scattered deep gouges in the frozen ground. At first, I thought it was an animal kill, the remains of a predator's feast. But there was no carcass, no bloodied remains, just the strange marks in the snow and the overwhelming sense that I was not alone. I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the icy air. My foot hit something buried beneath the snow, a bone, small and jagged, but not the kind of bone I'd expect from a deer or rabbit. It was too clean, too precise, like it had been stripped bare. A low groan echoed through the clearing, and I spun around, my pulse racing. The sound wasn't human, nor was it an animal. It was deep and resonant, like the earth itself was crying out. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching longer, darker. Then I saw it. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, something moved. At first, it was just a in shape, a dark silhouette against the white snow. But as it came closer, I saw it more clearly, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't human. It walked on two legs, but its movements were wrong, jerky, almost mechanical. Its body was too thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The skin, if you could call it that, was pale and mottled, like flesh that had been frozen and thawed too many times. Its eyes, black and sunken, locked onto mine, and I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move. In its hand it held something. At first I thought it was another bone, but as it raised the object, realized it wasn't a bone at all. It was a skull. The creature let out another groan, the sound vibrating through the air, and I stumbled back, my legs trembling. The skull in its hand wasn't animal, it was human, its hollow eyes staring at me, as though it could still see. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I turned to run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed endless as I ran, the trail of red snow flashing in my peripheral vision. The thing behind me didn't make much noise, just the occasional crunch of snow, the soft groan that seemed to grow louder with each step. I didn't dare look back. The clearing felt impossibly far, the trees blurring together as I pushed forward. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out, but I kept going, the creature's presence a constant weight at my back. Finally, I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the main trail. The sight of the familiar path filled me with a fleeting sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The groaning sound was closer now, almost right behind me. I turned, expecting to see the creature lunging for me, but the forest was empty. No trail of red snow, no bone-white figure, just the silent, snow-covered woods, as still and lifeless as when I had first arrived. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I sprinted back to my car, my boots slipping on the icy ground, my breath clouding in the freezing air. When I finally slammed the car door shut, I sat there for a long time, staring at the tree line, waiting for it to emerge. It never did, but the image of that thing, its hollow eyes, its jerky movements, the human skull in its hand, has never left me. I don't go into the woods anymore. I can't. But sometimes, on cold, quiet nights, I hear it. That low, resonant groan echoing in the back of my mind. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to follow the trail. The snowdrifts were taller than me, rising like frozen waves in the endless expanse of white. The storm had calmed hours ago, leaving behind a blindingly bright and eerily quiet landscape. I hadn't meant to wander so far, but the sheer stillness drew me in, pulling me deeper into the untouched wilderness. That's when I saw Ida's shadow, faint and out of place, nestled against the side of one of the larger snowdrifts. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the sun cast sharp contrasts on the snow. But as I approached, the shadow became sharper, more defined. It wasn't natural. There, half buried in the snow, was a doorway. It was tall and narrow, its edges perfectly straight, as though carved with precision. The frame was made of dark, weathered wood, frost clinging to its surface like veins. The door itself was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. There were no tracks leading to it, no sign that anyone had been there before me. The sight of it sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the doorway, torn between curiosity and an overwhelming sense of dread. Part of me wanted to turn back, to forget I'd ever seen it. But another part, the same reckless part that had led me this far into the snow, urged me forward. I reached out, my gloved hand trembling, as I touched the edge of the door. The wood was unnaturally cold, biting even through the thick material. I pushed gently, and the door creaked, open, the sound low and hollow, like a distant groan. What lay beyond wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a room. It wasn't even a space that made sense. Beyond the doorway was a tunnel, its walls shimmering faintly, as though made of ice. The air that spilled out was colder than anything I'd ever felt, a deep, biting chill that made my breath catch in my throat. But what struck me most was the light. It wasn't natural. It was faint and bluish, pulsing softly, casting shifting shadows that moved like they were alive. The light came from deep within the tunnel, beckoning me forward. Against my better judgment, I stepped through the doorway. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet you hear in the woods after a storm. It was deeper, heavier, like the world itself had stopped breathing. My footsteps echoed, faintly on the icy floor, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive stillness. The walls of the tunnel were smooth and cold, glistening faintly, as the bluish light reflected off their surfaces. The air felt dense, pressing down on me with every step. I didn't know why I kept going. Something about the light drew me in, even as every instinct screamed at me to turn back. As I walked, I noticed shapes in the ice. At first, they were faint and indistinct, little more than shadows. But as I went deeper, the shapes became clearer faces. They were trapped in the walls, their features twisted in fear and agony. Some had their eyes closed, their expressions frozen in a moment of despair, while others stared out with wide, hollow eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved. My stomach churned, and I tried to look away, but the faces were everywhere, embedded in the ice like grotesque sculptures. The light grew stronger ahead, pulsing rhythmically, like the heartbeat of something enormous. The tunnel opened into a cavern, and I stopped at the threshold, my breath catching in my throat. The cavern was massive, its walls and ceiling made of the same shimmering ice. In the center stood an enormous pillar, glowing with that eerie bluish light. It pulsed steadily, casting shifting shadows across the cavern. Around the pillar, the floor was covered in deep cracks, as though the ice couldn't contain whatever was within. And then I saw them. Figures moved around the pillar, their shapes barely distinguishable from the shadows. They were tall and thin, their limbs impossibly long, their movements slow and deliberate. Their faces were pale and featureless, and they didn't seem to notice me or didn't care. But something else did. From the base of the pillar, a shape began to emerge. It was enormous, its body shifting and writhing like liquid trapped in a solid form. Its surface shimmered like the ice, but it was darker, more alive. It had no clear shape, no eyes, but I felt its gaze lock onto me the moment it appeared. The cavern grew colder, and the air seemed to hum with a low, resonant sound that vibrated through my chest. The figures around the pillar turned toward me in unison, their faceless heads tilting as though curious. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. Then the thing by the pillar spoke not with words, but with a sound that filled my head, an overwhelming cacophony of whispers and screams that made me want to claw at my ears. Images flashed through my mind, the faces in the ice, the figures by the pillar, the doorway in the snowdrift. And then, darkness. "You don't belong here," the voice said, low and guttural, its meaning clear, despite the chaos in my mind. "Leave." I don't know how I made it out. One moment, I was standing in the cavern, frozen in place by that thing's presence. The next, I was outside, stumbling through the snowdrifts, the storm raging once more. The doorway was gone, the snow undisturbed, as though it had never been there. I didn't stop running until I reached my cabin, my chest heaving and my body trembling. The cold didn't leave me, no matter how close I sat to the fire. Even now, I can still feel it, a deep, bone-chilling cold that won't let go. And sometimes when the wind howls outside, I hear it, the faint sound of the doorway creaking, open, inviting me back. The storm had hit harder than expected, trapping me in the middle of nowhere with no clear path back to safety. The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing, pushing against me with every step. My coat, my gloves, even the scarf wrapped tightly around. My fastenone of it seemed enough to keep the cold from seeping into my bones. I didn't know where I was going anymore, only that I couldn't stop. Stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant death. Then I saw a figure through the swirling snow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the storm, maybe a tree or a shadow cast by the pale light of the moon. But as I drew closer, it became clearer. It was a person, standing motionless in the middle of the storm. Relief flooded through me, momentarily overpowering the gnawing fear in my chest. Another hiker, maybe someone else caught in the storm. "Hey," I called out, my voice hoarse from the cold. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move. I trudged closer, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, like the storm itself was trying to push me back. My relief turned to unease as the figure came into focus, its shape unnatural and wrong. Something wasn't right. And then I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It was me. The figure wasn't just similar to meat, was me, down to the last detail. My coat, my gloves, my scarf, even the small tear in my left sleeve, the one I hadn't bothered to patch. It was like looking into a mirror, but worse. The figure stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, its face pale and frozen. Its eyes were open, wide, and unblinking, and its skin was tinged blue with frost. Ice clung to its hair, eyebrows, forming delicate patterns across its face. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the icy ground. My pulse thundered in my ears. My breath came in short, ragged bursts that clouded the freezing air. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. The corpse stared at me. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice shaking as I tried to make what I was seeing. Its lips parted slightly, and a faint crackling sound broke through the storm. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was coming from the figure. The ice around its face shifted, cracking and splintering as it moved. It smiled. My legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as that frozen, lifeless thing that wore my face tilted, its head further. The smile widened unnaturally, the sound of ice breaking echoing in the otherwise silent storm. My stomach churned as I watched frost-coated teeth gleam in the moonlight. "Don't you recognize yourself?" it rasped, its voice low and hollow, as though the ice itself were speaking. I stumbled back again, my hands trembling. "This isn't real," I said, trying to convince myself. "This can't be real." The corpse took a step forward. The movement was stiff, jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Ice cracked and splintered with every motion, flakes of frost falling from its body. I could feel its gaze boring into me, those dead, empty eyes that mirrored my own. "You can't run from this," it said, its voice louder now, carrying over the storm. "You can't run from me." I turned and ran. The snow was deep, dragging at my legs, but I didn't stop. My breath came in frantic gasps, each exhale a sharp, painful cloud in the freezing air. The wind screamed around me, the storm growing fiercer with every step, as though the world itself was trying to trap me. Behind me, I heard the sound of ice breaking and shifting, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow. It was following me. I didn't dare look back. The trees closed in around me, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws. The path was uneven, the snow obscuring rocks and roots that threatened to trip me with every step. The cold was unbearable now, numbing my fingers and toes, slowing me down. The sound of footsteps grew louder. I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed to my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion. Storm howled around me, but I couldn't run anymore. My vision blurred, and the world tilted as I gasped for air. When I finally looked up, it was there. My frozen doppelganger stood at the edge of the clearing, its pale face illuminated by the faint light of the moon. It didn't smile this time. Its expression was emotionless, but its eyes burned with something dark, something hungry. "You can't escape," it said, taking another jerky step forward. "You belong to the cold now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The cold wrapped around me like a vice, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My vision dimmed, and the last thing before the darkness took me was its face hovering over me. I woke up in the snow, the storm gone, the sky clear. The forest was silent, the air crisp. I didn't know how long I'd been there, or how I was still alive. My body ached, and frostbite nipped at my fingers and toes, but I was alive. The clearing was empty. There was no sign of the frozen corpse, no trail in the snow to suggest it had ever been there. But the memory of it was burned into my mind. The way its lifeless eyes stared at me, the sound of its voice in the wind. I made my way back to the cabin, stumbling through the snow, my heart heavy with a fear I couldn't shake. Even now, safe by the fire, I can't escape the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. And sometimes when I look into the mirror, I swear I see frost beginning to creep across my reflection. The blizzard had swept through the region overnight, leaving the world buried under layers of snow and ice. I had ventured out after the storm, drawn by the eerie beauty of the frozen landscape. The air was sharp, the silence absolute, and every step I took echoed faintly in the vast emptiness. I didn't plan to wander far from the cabin, but the pristine stillness pulled me deeper into the woods. That's when I saw it, a strange formation of ice, shimmering faintly under the pale winter sun. It stood at the base of a rocky outcrop, a towering slab of frozen water that seemed to have no natural explanation. The ice was clear and smooth, surface untouched by the snow that blanketed everything else. Something about it felt ancient, like it didn't belong in this world. Curiosity got the better of me. As I approached, I noticed faint markings etched into the ice. At first, I thought they were cracks, the kind that form naturally when water freezes. But as I drew closer, I realized they were deliberate symbols, intricate and precise, carved with painstaking detail. My breath caught in my throat as I traced the patterns with my eyes. The carvings spiraled outward in complex designs, their lines sharp and clean despite the passage of time. Some of the symbols were familiar stars, moons, and shapes resembling animals, but others were completely alien, shapes that seemed to twist and writhe, though they were frozen in place. At the center of the ice was a circle, larger and deeper than the rest of the carvings. Within it was a figure, humanoid, but grotesque. Its limbs were elongated, its head crowned with jagged spikes that could have been horns. Its eyes, though merely depressions in the ice, seemed to watch me. A chill ran down my spine, deeper than the cold around me. I shouldn't have stayed. I should have turned back to the safety of the cabin. But something about the carvings held me in place, like they were whispering to me without sound. My gloved hand reached out, almost against my will, to touch the surface of the ice. The moment my fingers brushed it, a sharp, burning cold shot through my hand and up my arm, jerked back, but the sensation lingered, pulsing faintly under my skin. The symbols on the ice seemed to shimmer, catching the light in strange, unnatural ways. And then I heard a low, resonant hum, so deep it felt like it was vibrating through the ground. The sound wasn't coming from the forest or the wind. It was coming from the ice. The carvings began to glow, faint at first, like the light of distant stars, but growing steadily brighter. The symbols pulsed in rhythm with the hum, their glow casting strange, shifting shadows on the snow. The figure in the center seemed to shift slightly, though the ice remained solid. I stepped back, my heart pounding, but I couldn't look away. The light grew brighter still, and the hum became a deep, guttural chant, a chorus of voices that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. And then the ice cracked. The sound was deafening, a sharp, splintering noise through the air like a scream. Fractures spider-webbed across the surface, radiating outward from the figure in the center. The glow intensified, and the chant grew louder, filling the air with an unbearable weight. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me shifted. The snow felt thin, fragile, as though something beneath it was stirring. The hum became a roar, and I fell to my knees, the ice beneath, the snow cracking and groaning with each passing second. A voice broke through the chaos, not loud, but sharp and clear, cutting through the cacophony like a knife. "Stay." I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The figure in the ice wasn't just a carving anymore. It was moving. The jagged, humanoid form twisted and writhed beneath the surface, its elongated limbs pressing against the ice as though trying to break free. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and the glow from the carvings reflected in their empty depths. "Witness," the voice said, though no mouth moved. The ice shattered. The world seemed to explode around me. Shards of ice flew through the air, glittering like shards of glass in the faint sunlight. I shielded my face, the cold cutting into my skin like knives. When the chaos subsided, the slab of ice was gone, replaced by a jagged hole in the ground. And the figure was free. It stood in the center of the clearing, impossibly tall, its jagged limbs glistening with frost. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it was testing the limits of its newly found freedom. The air around it grew colder, the frost spreading rapidly across the ground in intricate patterns. My body refused to move, frozen in place by terror and the bone-deep chill. The creature turned, its head toward me, its spiked crown glinting faintly. For a moment, it simply stared, its hollow eyes seeming to peer into something far deeper than flesh. Then it took a step forward. The ground beneath me groaned, the cracks spreading toward my feet. I stumbled back, finally, breaking free of whatever force had held me. The creature didn't follow, but its presence loomed, filling the clearing with an oppressive weight. The hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the air. The symbols carved into the ice reappeared, glowing faintly on the ground beneath the creature's feet. Its voice echoed once more, cold and hollow. "The ritual is complete. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. My memory of the return trip is a blur of snow and panic, the biting cold barely registering as I fled. When I finally slammed the door shut, behind me, I collapsed by the fire, trembling and gasping for air. The forest was quiet again, the storm long gone, but the air still felt heavy, as though the presence I had encountered lingered just beyond the tree line. I haven't gone back to the outcrop. I haven't told anyone what I saw. But some nights, when the wind is still, I hear the faint hum in the distance, growing louder, closer. The ritual may have ended, but whatever I freed isn't done yet. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was the kind of silence that shouldn't exist. A deep, unnatural quiet that felt wrong in every way. No hum of the heater, no creak of the wooden cabin settling, not even the faint rustle of our wind against the windows. I opened my eyes and saw the morning light streaming through the frosted window panes, but something about it felt. The second thing I noticed was the cold. It was bone deep, a freezing stillness that seemed to press against me from every direction. My breath puffed out in small clouds, hanging in the air longer than it should have. The air itself felt heavy, motionless, as though the world had forgotten how to move. I sat up slowly, my blanket stiff with frost, and looked around the room. The cabin was as it had been the night before, but everything was coated in a thin layer of ice. The table, the chairs, even the old clock on the wall all frozen, as though trapped in a moment of time. The fire in the hearth was still there, its flames caught mid-dance, froze lace like a photograph. My heart began to race. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shattering the silence like a rock through glass. But it felt wrong. Too loud. Too sharp in the stillness. The sound didn't echo. It just stopped, swallowed up by the frozen air. I swung my legs off the bed, my feet landing on the icy floor with a soft crunch. The cold bit at my skin, but I barely noticed it. All I could think about was the stillness, the absolute, unyielding stillness. The window was frosted over, but I could see enough to know something was wrong outside. 2. The snow-covered forest that surrounded the cabin seemed frozen in time. Trees stood, motionless, their branches heavy with ice, and the snowdrifts sparkled unnaturally, untouched by even the faintest breeze. I had to see for myself. I bundled up in my coat, scarf, and gloves, though it felt like a futile effort against the cold that seemed to come from everywhere. The door creaked as I opened it, the only sound in the frozen world, and I stepped outside. The air was so cold it burned my lungs, and the light was harsh, reflecting off the ice with a sharp brilliance that made my eyes water. The forest stretched out before me, silent and still. I took a step forward, my boots crunching on the snow, the sound startlingly loud in the eerie quiet. Everything was frozen. A bird perched on a low branch, its wings half open as though caught mid-flight. A squirrel clung to the bark of a tree, its body stiff and unmoving. Even the clouds above were frozen in place, hanging in the sky like painted streaks of white. The world wasn't just cold, it was lifeless. I walked further, the snow crunching rhythmically beneath my boots. The stillness was oppressive, the silence pressing against my ears, until I thought I might scream just to hear something, anything. But something held me back, instinctive fear that told me breaking the silence again might draw attention. Attention from what, I didn't know, but the thought chilled me more than the cold ever could. I wandered for what felt like hours, though time seemed meaningless in a world that didn't move. The sun didn't shift in the sky, and the shadows remained exactly where they were. My breath hung in the air, each exhale a lingering reminder of the only movement left in this frozen place. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the forest. It was distant, barely more than a shadow against the frozen landscape. At first, I thought it might be a tree, its shape distorted by the shimmering light. But as I moved closer, I realized it was a person or something that looked like a person. They stood perfectly still, their body cloaked in something that shimmered faintly, like frost, catching the light. Their head was tilted slightly, as though they were listening. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But then, they moved. It wasn't much a slight shift, the faintest tilt of their head, but in a world where nothing else moved, it was enough to send a bolt of fear through me. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot, but I forced myself to take a step back. The figure turned toward me. Their face was pale, almost luminous, and their eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of light in the frozen world. They raised a hand, their movements slow and deliberate, and pointed at me. "You are not supposed to be here," they said, their voice low and resonant, like the groaning of ice under pressure. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The figure stepped closer, beneath their feet unmarked, as though they weren't truly touching the ground. "This is not your place," they continued, their voice growing colder. "You don't belong." My instincts screamed at me to run, but the cold had sapped my strength, my body refusing to move. The figure stopped a few feet away, their glowing eyes piercing through me. "Leave," they said, their voice echoing in the stillness, "before you forget how to move." The ground beneath me began to shift, the ice groaning and cracking faintly. I stumbled back, my legs finally obeying, and turned to run. The forest seemed endless as I fled, the stillness pressing against me with every step. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving. The silence inside was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. I didn't sleep that night. The memory of the figure's glowing eyes burned into my mind. When dawn finally came, the world had returned to normal. The fire crackled in the hearth, wind rustled the trees, and the snow outside was soft and powdery again. but I couldn't shake the feeling that the stillness was waiting, lurking just beyond the edges of the moving world. And sometimes, in the coldest hours of the night, I hear it, the faint sound of ice groaning, the whisper of a voice I'll never forget. You don't belong. It began with the snow-thick, endless, and disorienting. I had been hiking through the forest for hours, trying to navigate the narrow trail that wound between towering pines. The storm had erased all landmarks, leaving only a white expanse in every direction. The air was sharp and cold, and the crunch of my boots was the only sound in the silence. Then I saw them footprints in the snow. They were fresh, perfectly defined, cutting a path through the forest ahead of me. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. Relief mixed with unease. It was strange to come across another person out here, especially with the storm still looming. But as I approached, something about the prints gave me pause. They were mine. The pattern of the tread was unmistakable. Me boots. The size, the spacing, the slight drag on the left foot where I'd slipped earlier, they were identical. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the trail ahead, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't been this way before. At least, I didn't think I had. But the footprints told a different story. Panic whispered at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it down. Maybe I'd gotten turned around. Maybe I had doubled back without realizing it. The snow could disorient anyone. I convinced myself it was nothing and followed the trail, hoping it would lead me out of the woods. The path wound deeper into the forest, the footprints steady and deliberate. The trees grew thicker here, their branches heavy with snow, forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the storm were pressing in on me. The longer I walked, the more I noticed the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, it was oppressive, smothering, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, the sound absorbed by the stillness. I stopped, my breath fogging in the frozen air, and looked around. The trail of footprints continued ahead, unwavering. But something about the path felt wrong. The forest was unfamiliar, the trees twisted and gnarled in ways I didn't recognize. I'd walked these woods dozens of times before, but I couldn't place this part of it. The footprints didn't hesitate, though. They led me forward, drawing me deeper into the unknown. I don't know how long I walked before I saw it. A clearing opened up ahead, the snow pristine and untouched except for the path of footprints, leading straight to its center. There, rising from the snow like an ancient relic, was a structure, small and weathered, its wood dark and splintered with age. It was a cabin, but it wasn't my cabin. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades, the windows frosted over, and the door hanging slightly ajar. Snow had piled up against its walls, but there were no tracks leading to or from it except mine. The trail of my footprints stopped at the front door. I stared at the cabin, dread pooling in my stomach. I didn't recognize it, and yet, something about it felt familiar, like I'd been here before, like I'd seen it in a dreamer, a memory I couldn't quite grasp. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. My breath hitched as I took a step forward. Then, another, drawn toward the cabin despite the voice in my head screaming at me to turn back. My boots sank into the snow, leaving fresh prints alongside the trail I had already made. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air around the cabin was colder, biting at my skin even through my coat. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, pushed open with a soft creak. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of wood and frost. The room was small, sparsely furnished, a table, a single chair, and a bed pushed against the far wall. A fire burned low in the hearth, its flames frozen in mid-dance, casting eerie shadows that didn't move. Then I saw it. Sitting at the table, facing the doorway, was a figure. It was me. I staggered back, my boots slipping on the icy floor. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but its eyes ice-locked onto mine. They were hollow, lifeless, but there was a flicker of recognition in them, as though it knew me, understood me, in a way no one else ever could. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. Its voice was my voice, but colder, sharper, filled with something I couldn't name. The figure stood slowly, its movements stiff and unnatural, and took a step toward me. I stumbled back, the door slamming shut behind me. The room grew darker, the shadows lengthening, twisting around the walls like living things. My self stopped in the center of the room, its head tilting slightly as though studying me. "Why are you here?" it asked, its voice echoing in the suffocating silence. I don't know," I stammered, my throat dry. "I followed the footprints. My footprints." The figure smiled, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was hollow, mocking, as though it knew something I didn't. "These are not your footprints," it said. The room began to shift. The walls groaned, the wood splintered cracking, and the frozen flames in the hearth flickered back to life, casting a harsh, flickering light. My other self took another step toward me, its hollow eyes gleaming with something dark and unrelenting. "You followed a path that wasn't yours," it said, "and now you can't leave." I don't remember how I escaped. One moment, I was inside the cabin, the figure standing over me. The next, I was stumbling through the snow, gasping for air, the clearing far behind me. The storm had returned, the wind howling through the trees, erasing the trail of footprints I had followed. I made it back to my own cabin just as night fell, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. But even now, sitting by the fire, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't truly leave that place. And sometimes when I step outside, I see them footprints in the snow. My footprints, leading us back to the woods. And I know if I follow them again, I won't come back. The frozen woods were silent, the kind of silence that presses against you and makes every sound you make feel too loud. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked, the cold biting at my face despite the scarf wrapped tightly around it. The late afternoon light was dim, the sun struggling to break through the gray clouds that hung low over the horizon. I had been out longer than I should have, but the peace of the forest after the storm was too alluring to ignore. The fresh snow blanketed the ground in an unbroken sheet, untouched by animals or people. It felt like I was the only one in the world. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape at the edge of my vision, a pale smudge against the dark line of trees ahead. I stopped walking, my breath fogging the air as I squinted into the distance. There, just beyond the tree line, something was standing. It was a figure, unnaturally tall and thin, its skin pale as the snow around it. It stood completely plaff-daff, still half hidden among the trees, its form almost blending into the frozen landscape. But the longer I stared, the more distinct it became. It was watching me. My heart began to race, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a broken tree, or an oddly shaped patch of snow. I took a cautious step forward. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, its face hidden in shadow. I called out, my voice cracking in the cold air. "Hello? Is someone there?" The sound of my own voice felt wrong, too sharp in the oppressive quiet. The figure didn't respond. It didn't flinch, didn't react at all, but I could feel its attention, a weight pressing against me like a predator sizing up its prey. The wind picked up, carrying a bitter chill that made me pull my coat tighter. Remained still, unbothered by the biting cold. Something about it was deeply, fundamentally, wrong. I took another step forward, my boots crunching loudly on the snow, and then I stopped. My gut twisted with unease. The forest ahead felt darker, the trees leaning closer together, as though they were trying to block my path. I could feel the weight of the figure's gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes. And then it moved. It wasn't a natural motion. It didn't walk or step, it glided, shifting smoothly from one spot to another without disturbing the snow beneath it. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. "Who are you?" I shouted, the tremor in my voice betraying my fear. It didn't answer. It stopped just at the edge of the woods, still half hidden among the trees, tilted its head slightly. The motion was slow, deliberate, and deeply unsettling, as though it was studying me. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were frozen to the ground, my body paralyzed by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The figure tilted its head again, its pale form shimmering faintly in the dim light, and then it raised an arm. It pointed at me. The gesture broke whatever trance I was in. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned, running as fast as the deep snow would allow. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my throat. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees blurring together as I fled. I didn't dare look back. The silence of the woods was gone, replaced by the pounding of my own heartbeat and the faint crunch of snow behind me. I wasn't alone. It was following me. The snow became deeper, the effort of running through it draining my strength. My legs burned, and my chest ached, but I couldn't stop. The sound of movement behind me grew louder, closer, and I could feel its presence, cold and heavy, pressing against my back. I stumbled out of the woods and into the clearing near my cabin. The sight of the familiar building filled me with a fleeting sense of safety, but I didn't slow down. I practically threw myself through the door, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wood, trying to catch my breath. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. For a long moment, the only sound was the pounding of my heart and the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. I waited, straining to hear anything outside, but there was nothing. Finally, I moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The clearing was empty, the edge of the woods shrouded in shadow. There was no sign of the figure, but I could feel it. Even now, safe inside the cabin, the weight of its gaze lingered, a phantom pressure that refused to fade. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the woods, its pale form blending into the snow, its head tilting as it watched me. The next morning, I ventured outside, the sunlight doing little to ease my unease. The snow was pristine, untouched, with no tracks to suggest anyone or anything had been there. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't over. Now, every time I step outside, I feel its presence, just beyond the tree line, waiting. And some nights, when the wind is quiet and the forest is still, I swear I see it again standing at the edge of the frozen woods, watching and pointing. The snowstorm had been relentless, a blinding wall of white that turned the world into a frozen void. By the time it passed, I was hopelessly lost. The familiar trail I'd been following was buried, and every direction looked the serene, endless expanse of snow and ice, broken only by the dark silhouettes of skeletal trees. I trudged on, my legs heavy and my breath visible in the freezing air. My fingers were numb, despite my gloves, and the biting cold seeped into my bones. I knew I needed shelter soon. Without it, I wouldn't last much longer. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, some shadow cast by the trees, but as I got closer, its shape became clear-angular, unnatural, out of place in the wilderness. It was a house, its roof barely visible under the thick snowdrifts that covered it. The windows were dark, the walls frosted over, and the front door stood slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been there. There was no record of a house in this area. I'd hiked these woods for years and never seen anything like it. But there it was, rising out of the snow like a forgotten relic, its presence filling me with equal parts relief and unease. I had no choice. The cold wouldn't let me second guess. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence. Inside, the air was cold but still, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. Snow had drifted into the entryway, pooling on the warped wooden floor. The house was old, far older than it had any right to be. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the furniture was covered in sheets of frost. A broken chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals glinting faintly in the dim light, filtering through the windows. Something about the place felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself was watching me. But I was too cold and too desperate to care. I closed the door behind me and moved deeper inside, my boots echoing loudly in the silence. I found the fireplace in what must have once been a living room. The ashes in the hearth were long dead, but there was wood stacked neatly beside it, dry and ready to burn. That should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. I hesitated but eventually set to work. The fire caught quickly, its warmth spreading through the room, and I collapsed onto an old armchair, pulling my coat tighter around me. The heat was a blessing, chasing the numbness from my fingers and toes, but it little to ease the growing unease in my chest. The house was too quiet. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm messing with my nerves, but every creak of the floorboards and groan of the walls set me on edge. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something or someone staring back at me, but the snow outside was unbroken. No tracks, no movement, just an endless, frozen wasteland. As the fire burned lower, I explored the house, hoping to distract myself from the gnawing dread that wouldn't leave me. The rooms were sparse, filled with furniture covered in frost and layers of dust. There were no signs of life, no photographs, no personal belongings. It was as though the house had been abandoned for decades, and yet it didn't feel empty. The upstairs hallway was narrow and dim, the walls lined with doors that led to rooms filled with shadows. I opened each one cautiously, my breath fogging in the icy air. Most were empty, an old bed here, a dresser there, but one room at the end of the hall made me stop. It was a child's room. The wallpaper was faded but still showed faint patterns of stars and moons. A small bed sat in the corner, its sheets stiff with frost. Toys were scattered across the floor, their colors muted by time. On the wall opposite the bed was a mirror, its surface cracked but still reflecting the faint light from the window. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat as I approached the mirror. The reflection was warped, the cracks distorting my image. But as I stared, I noticed something else. There was a figure behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned back to the mirror, my reflection trembling with fear. The figure was still there. It was tall and pale, its face indistinct, its body shrouded in what looked like tattered fabric. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but its presence filled the room like a physical weight. My legs felt frozen in place, my body refusing to obey, as the figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice low and resonant, like ice cracking under pressure. The air in the room grew colder, the frost on the walls creeping closer. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a toy, and fell hard onto the frozen floor. The figure stepped forward, the sound of its movement like the groaning of old wood. "Leave," it whispered, and the mirror shattered. I don't remember how I made it out of the house. One moment, I was scrambling down the hallway, the figure's voice echoing in my ears. The next, I was outside, the snow blinding and the wind howling around me. When I looked back, the house was gone. The snow-covered field where it had stood was empty, the drifts unbroken, as though nothing had ever been there. My chest heaved as I stumbled back through the woods, desperate to find my way home. Even now, safe and warm in my cabin, I can't shake the feeling that the house is still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble upon it. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind howls and the frost creeps across my windows, I hear its voice. "You shouldn't be here." The snow crunched under my boots as I trudged through the forest, the biting cold nipping at my face despite the scarf wrapped tightly around it. The trail I was following had all but disappeared, under the fresh snow from the storm the night before. I didn't mind. The woods were serene, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you are the only person in the world. But then I heard the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an echo, the noise of my own boots ricocheting off the trees. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. The footsteps didn't match mine. They were slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. I stopped walking, my breath clouding in the icy air, and turned to look behind me. There was nothing. The path I had made through the snow stretched back into the woods, untouched by any other tracks. The trees stood silent, their branches heavy with frost, and the air was so still I could hear my own heartbeat. I told myself it was just my imagination. The snow, the quiet, it was easy to start hearing things in a place like this. Shaking my head, I turned and kept walking. But after only a few steps, the sound came again. Footsteps. Louder this time. I stopped again, my chest tightening. This time, I didn't turn away. Instead, I listened, my ears straining to pick up anything beyond the sound of my own breathing. The footsteps continued for a moment, then stopped, perfectly mirroring my own pause. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Slowly, I turned my expecting to see someone or something standing behind me. There was nothing. No tracks. No figure. Just the unbroken expanse of snow and the dark silhouettes of the trees. My stomach churned as a deep unease settled over me. I wasn't alone. I couldn't be. I took another step forward, testing the silence, and the footsteps came again. This time, didn't stop when I did. They kept going, crunching steadily through the snow, circling around me, like an invisible predator. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The forest didn't answer. I started walking faster, my boots sinking into the snow with each hurried step. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, matching my pace. My breathing turned ragged, the cold air burning my lungs. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sound was too close now, as if whatever was following me was just behind my shoulder. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the snow was too deep, the terrain too uneven. Running would only make me fall, make me vulnerable. So I forced myself to keep walking, even as the footsteps closed in. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The footsteps stopped again, and for a moment, the only sound was the pounding of my heart. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, their breath fogging in the icy air. But the path behind me was empty. No tracks, no sign of movement, just the trail I had made, stark and lonely in the pristine snow. I pressed on, my steps growing more frantic. The silence around me felt oppressive, the air heavy, with an unnatural stillness. The trees seemed closer now, their branches leaning in like skeletal hands. My boots slipped on the uneven ground, and I stumbled, catching myself on a low branch. That's when I saw them. In the distance, just beyond the edge of my vision, a set of footprints trailed through the snow. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, and they led into the woods, disappearing between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen those before. They hadn't been there earlier. The footsteps behind me started again. This time they were faster, heavier, the sound unmistakable as they crunched through the snow. They weren't just following me anymore, they were rushing toward me. Panic overtook me, and I broke into a run, my boots slipping and sliding as I fought to stay upright. The forest blurred around me, the shadows of the trees stretching and twisting in my peripheral vision. The footsteps were deafening now, pounding in my ears, but when I glanced back, there was still no one there. I burst into a clearing, my legs trembling, and my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps stopped the moment I crossed into the open space, the silence crashing down around me like a wave. I turned in a circle, my eyes scanning the tree line, but the forest was empty. The clearing felt wrong. The snow here was pristine, untouched by any tracks mine or otherwise. The trees stood in a perfect circle, their branches heavy with frost, and the air was colder than it had been before. My breath clouded in front of me, hanging in the stillness like a frozen mist. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its body pale and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. Didn't move, didn't breathe, but I could feel its eyes on me, even though its face was featureless. My chest tightened, and my legs refused to move. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if curious, and then it took a step forward. The snow beneath it didn't crunch. It didn't even leave footprints. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice low and resonant, like the groaning of ice. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and turned to flee. The forest closed in around me, the trees blurring together as I ran. My legs burned, and my lungs ached, but I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods and saw the faint outline of my cabin. Even now, safe inside, I can't forget the sound of those footsteps or the way they stopped. Just before I reached the clearing, I don't go hiking in the snow anymore, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear it again, the faint crunch of footsteps behind me, and when I look, here is nothing there. The mask was buried beneath a sheet of ice, half hidden by the snowdrifts that covered the forest floor. I found it by accident, my foot slipping on the frozen ground and sending me sprawling onto the frosted earth. When I brushed the snow away, my fingers froze mid-movement. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The mask was smooth, carved from something that resembled glass but felt colder, sharper, as though it had been hewn from the ice itself. Its surface shimmered faintly, catching the pale light of the winter sun. The design was intricate, its features human-like but exaggerated, almost otherworldly. The hollow eye sockets were larger than they should have been, their edges sharp and angular, and the lips were curved into a faint, almost mocking smile. What struck me most was the chill emanating from it. Even through my gloves, I could feel the cold radiating from the mask, seeping into my skin like it was alive. I should have left it there. Everything about it screamed danger, from the unnatural chill to the strange pull I felt just looking at it. But something about the mask held me in place, my hand hovering above it. Before I could think better of it, I picked it up. The cold was unbearable, biting through my gloves and into my bones, but I didn't drop it. The mask felt heavier than it looked, as though it carried a weight that had nothing to do with its physical form. I turned it over in my hands, the faint shimmer on its surface catching my eye. A whisper echoed faintly through the stillness of the forest. I froze, looking around, but there was no one there. The sound didn't come from the woods. It came from the mask. The whisper grew louder, words indistinct but insistent, pressing into my mind like a weight. My heart pounded as I stared into the empty eye sockets, the urge to put the mask on growing stronger with every passing second. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the cold, the isolation, the strange allure of the mask itself. But before I could stop myself, I raised it to my face. The moment it touched my skin, the world changed. The cold disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming warmth that spread through my body like fire. My vision blurred, then sharpened, the forest around me taking on an unnatural clarity. Every branch, every snowflake, every shadow became painfully vivid, as though the mask was pulling back a veil I hadn't known was there. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, resonant tone, deep and commanding, echoing through my mind. "You are not who you were," it said, "but you could be." I tried to pull the mask off, but it wouldn't budge. It clung to my skin like it was part of me, its surface growing warmer with every second. My breathing quickened, panic rising as the voice grew louder. "Look." The forest around me shifted. The snow turned darker, the trees taller, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. Shadows moved between them, too quick and fleeting to catch. My reflection appeared on the icy ground beneath my feet, but it wasn't Menet anymore. The face staring back at me was sharper, its features more defined, its eyes glowing faintly. Mask had changed me. No, it had revealed something beneath me. Something I hadn't known was there. The voice returned, softer now, almost coaxing. "You can be stronger. You can be more." I could feel the mask seeping into me, filling the empty spaces inside. Memories I didn't Recognize flooded my mind, faces I'd never seen, places I'd never been. I wasn't just seeing the world differently. I was becoming someone else. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in the grip of the mask. Time meaningless. The boundaries between myself and the thing I was becoming blurring with every passing moment. But then, a sound broke through the distant howl of wind through the trees, sharp and real. It snapped me back, and I yanked at the mask with everything I had. The pain was excruciating, like tearing away part of my own skin, but I didn't stop. Finally, with one last desperate pull, the mask came free. The world around me snapped back to normal. The forest was quiet again, the snow pale and undisturbed. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared down at the mask in my hands. Its surface no longer shimmering but dull and lifeless. For a moment I thought I had broken whatever spell it carried, but then I noticed the faintest glimmer in the eye sockets, a flicker of something waiting, watching. I buried the mask where I found it, shoving snow and ice over it until it was hidden from view. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, calling out to me in the silence of the forest. Even now, safe in my cabin, I feel its presence. It's not just a memory, it's inside me, a whisper, at the edges of my mind, and when I catch my reflection in the frost-covered windows, I swear I see it again, that sharp, unrecognizable face staring back at me. The storm was relentless, its howling winds tearing through the forest and obliterating any sense of direction. I hadn't meant to go so far, but the snow had turned the familiar trails into a maze of white, and soon I was hopelessly lost. As night fell, the cold became unbearable, seeping into my bones and numbing my hands and feet. I needed shelter, and I needed it fast. That's when I found the cave. Its entrance was narrow, half buried in a drift of snow, but inside, the space widened into a hollow chamber. The walls glistened with ice, their surfaces smooth and cold, reflecting the faint light of my flashlight like mirrors. The air was frigid, but at least it was calm, untouched by the biting wind outside. I set up as best as I could, piling my pack against the wall and wrapping myself tightly in my sleeping bag. The fire I tried to start sputtered and died quickly. Cold was too strong, the walls seeming to suck away the heat before it could take hold. Exhaustion overwhelmed me, and, despite the numbing chill, I fell asleep. I woke to silence, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, heavy, as if the world itself had been muted. My breath fogged in the icy air, and for a moment, I thought nothing had changed. But then I noticed the light. It wasn't the dim gray light of the snowstorm outside. It was brighter, sharper, casting strange, dancing patterns across the icy walls of the cave. My flashlight was off, and the glow didn't come from the fire, it came from outside, spilling into the cave like liquid sunlight. I sat up, every muscle in my body aching from the cold. Something felt different. The air was lighter, warmer, and the icy walls seemed to hum faintly, vibrating with an energy I couldn't explain. My stomach twisted as I crawled toward the entrance, my boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. When I stepped outside, the world was unrecognizable. The snow was gone. In its place was a sprawling valley, lush and green, bathed in the golden light of a sun that hung lower in the sky than I had ever seen. The trees were enormous, their trunks thick and gnarled, their leaves shimmering as though coated in silver. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the hum of unseen insects and the distant calls of birds I didn't recognize. But it wasn't just the landscape that was different. There were no trails, no signs of civilization, no remnants of the world I had known. The horizon stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged mountains that seemed impossibly tall, their peaks glinting with ice that never melted. I stumbled forward, my legs weak and unsteady, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The storm, the caveat must have been a dream. It had to be. But the warmth on my skin, the unfamiliar scent of the air, the sounds of life all around mate, was too real. And then I saw them. At first, they were just shadows, moving between the trees. Tall, graceful shapes, their movements deliberate and silent. My breath caught in my throat as one of them stepped into the open. It wasn't human. It stood taller than any person I'd ever seen, its body slender and elongated, its skin a pale, translucent blue that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Its face was sharp and angular, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. It wore no clothing, but its body was adorned with intricate patterns that glinted like frost on glass. It stared at me, unblinking, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. I took a step back, my boots crunching loudly on the ground, and the sound seemed to break the spell. The figure tilted its head, a gesture that might have been curiosity or something else. Raised one long, delicate hand and pointed toward me. "You are out of place," it said. Its voice was soft but resonant, like the sound of ice cracking on a still lake. The words didn't match its lips, as though the sound came from the air itself rather than its mouth. I don't understand," I stammered, my voice trembling. "Where am I?" It didn't answer. More figures emerged from the trees, their movements silent and fluid, their glowing eyes fixed on me. There were at least a dozen of them now, surrounding me in a loose circle. None of them spoke, but their presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight that made my knees weak. The first figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "You should not be here." "I didn't mean to," I said quickly, panic rising in my chest. "I was in a storm. I just needed shelter." The figure tilted its head again, and for a moment, I thought it might reach out and touch me. But, instead, it stepped back, its gaze shifting to the cave behind me. "You walked through the veil," it said. "The ice remembers, and now it keeps you." The words made no sense, but the weight of them settled over me like a shroud. I turned to look, back at the cave, its icy walls shimmering faintly in the golden light. It looked different now, more alive, as though it were breathing, its surface rippling with faint patterns that resembled the figure's markings. "I want to go back," I said, my voice cracking. "Please, I didn't mean to." "You cannot return," the figure said, its voice colder now. "The time you left is no longer yours." The world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath me shifting, as though it were unstable. The figures stepped closer, their glowing eyes locking onto mine. "You belong to this place now," the first figure said. "The ice will decide what you become." I don't remember how long I was there, or how I finally made it back. One moment, I was surrounded by those otherworldly beings, their eyes piercing through me. The next, I was stumbling through the snow, the storm raging around me once more. When I reached my cabin, I slammed the door shut and collapsed onto the floor, trembling and gasping for air. The warmth of the fire didn't touch me, and the frostbite on my fingers and toes was worse than I'd realized. But the worst part was the reflection in the window. My face wasn't the same. The sharp angles, the faint shimmer beneath my skin, the glow in my eyesit was all there, faint but undeniable. And now, even in the quiet of my cabin, I can still hear their voices, soft, distant, calling to me. The ice remembers, and it's waiting. The frozen lake stretched out before me, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the pale light of the winter sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eeriness that seemed to blanket the forest in silence. I had wandered out here to escape the claustrophobia of the cabin, hoping the crisp air would clear my head. But as I stood there, staring at the unbroken expanse of ice, I felt something stir deep in my chest. A sense of unease, faint at first, but growing stronger with every passing second. I couldn't explain it. The lake was beautiful, serene. Nothing about it felt wrong. I stepped cautiously onto the ice, my boots crunching softly against the frost. The lake was solid, its surface unyielding beneath my weight. I took another step, then another, moving further out from the snow-covered shore. The air grew colder the further I went, wind biting at my face. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light a-glimmer beneath the ice, faint and fleeting. But as I leaned closer, peering into the glassy surface, I saw them clearly. Eyes. They blinked at me from beneath the ice, wide, and unblinking. The irises were pale, almost translucent, and they seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Human too large, too round, and set at odd angles, as though they didn't belong to a single creature but to many. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, the ice groaning faintly beneath my boots. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared down at the lake. The eyes were gone, the surface of the ice, smooth and featureless once more. I told myself I'd imagined it. The cold, the isolation, it was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Those eyes had been real, and they had been watching me. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to stay. I knelt down, my breath fogging the ice as I pressed my gloved hand against its surface. The chill seeped into my skin, sharper than before, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the eyes returned. This time there were more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, blinking in unison, their pale glow, casting faint patterns beneath the ice. They moved slowly, shifting as though carried by an unseen current. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't floating aimlessly. They were following me. The silence of the lake was broken by a faint, rhythmic, sounded deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated through the ice, into my hands and knees, filling my chest with an almost unbearable pressure. And then, the eyes moved closer. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and the ice beneath me began to groan. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, faint, but growing with every step I took. The eyes followed, their glow intense, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that they weren't just beneath the ice. They were rising. The surface bulged slightly, the frozen lake stretching like a membrane, and I backed away, my legs trembling. The hum turned into a low, guttural roar, and the cracks spread faster, the ice fracturing in jagged lines that raced toward me. I turned and ran. The lake groaned and splintered beneath my boots, the sound deafening, but I didn't look back. My breath came in frantic gasps, each exhale a visible cloud in the freezing air. The shore felt impossibly far, the trees on the edge of the lake blurred and distorted by the haze of my panic. Behind me, the ice shattered. I reached the shore and collapsed into the snow, my chest heaving as I turned to look back. Lake was still, its surface eerily calm, the cracks gone, the ice unbroken, and the pale eyes had disappeared. But the hum remained, faint now, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the ground beneath me. It wasn't coming from the lake anymore. It was deeper, older, as though the ice itself was alive, its heartbeat thrumming faintly in the cold air. I stood, my legs unsteady, and stumbled back toward the safety of the cabin. The forest felt darker, the shadows deeper, but I didn't stop. Dare. Even now, safe inside with the fire roaring, I can't shake the feeling of those eyes. They're burned into my mind, unblinking and pale, follow me even in the corners of my vision. And at night, when the wind howls and the frost creeps across the windows, I hear the hum, again low and resonant, vibrating through the air, waiting. The storm had pushed me deep into the woods, further than I had ever gone before. I wasn't even sure how I ended up there, stumbling through the snow, the wind tearing at my coat. The trees grew closer together, their branches heavy with frost, and the light in the overcast sky barely made it through the dense canopy. Every breath I took felt sharp and cold, and my legs burned from the effort of pushing through the deep snow. That's when I saw it. A faint shimmer in the distance, something catching the weak light, like glass or metal. Hesitated, squinting through the flurries of snow, and decided to move closer. The shimmer came from a mound of ice, strange and unnatural, rising from the ground like a frozen wave. Its surface was smooth, almost polished, and at its center, half encased in frost, was a book. It shouldn't have been there. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. Who would leave a book out here, in the middle of nowhere? And how was it frozen like that, perfectly preserved, its cover still visible through the Thick layer of ice. The title was faint, the letters warped by frost, but it looked ancient, older than the forest itself. Something about it pulled me closer. My heart pounded as I reached out, my gloved hand brushing the edge of the ice. The cold was sharp, almost painful, but I couldn't pull away. Before I realized what I was doing, I was clawing at the ice, chipping away the frost, until the book was free. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, the edges frayed, but it felt warm in my hands, like it had been waiting for me. I didn't open it right away. Something about the book made my stomach twist with unease. The cover was blank except for a faint, almost ghostly imprint of a symbol with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun or a web. It was strange, almost hypnotic, and I had to force myself to look away. The storm had eased, but the cold was relentless, and I knew I couldn't stay out in the open much longer. I tucked the book under my arm and headed back the way I came, my mind racing with questions. Why was the book there? Who left it? And why had I felt so compelled to take it? By the time I reached my cabin, night had fallen. I set the book on the table, its dark cover standing out against the pale light of the oil lamp. The room felt colder than usual, the air heavy, with a stillness that made my skin crawl. Finally, I opened it. The first page was blank, the parchment yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. I turned to the next page, then the next, my fingers trembling. The handwriting was uneven, spidery, as though it had been written by someone in great haste or great fear. At first, the words made no sense. They were jumbled, fragmented, like the ramblings of a madman. But as I read, the lines began to shift, rearranging themselves into something coherent. My breath caught in my throat as the text became clear. It was writing about me. The words described the storm, the woods, and the frozen mound where I had found the book. It described my discovery of it, the way I had clawed at the ice, the exact moment I had opened its cover. My hands shook as I turned the page, the words changing as I read. They told of me sitting in the cabin, staring at the book, and then they continued describing an event hadn't happened yet. The next page spoke of a knock at the door, sharp and deliberate. It spoke of me freezing in place, unable to breathe, as I waited for the second knock. And then, as if summoned by the text, the knock came. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and unnatural. It raced as I stared at the door, the book trembling in my hands. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The second knock came, louder. This time, more insistent. The book's words shifted again, the lines reforming into new sentences, urging me to answer the door. My hands felt like ice as I closed the book and set it down, my legs trembling as I forced myself to stand. The knocking continued, steady and patient, as though whatever was outside was all the time in the world. When I opened the door, there was no one there. The snow outside was untouched, pristine, as though no one had been near the cabin. But the air felt different, colder, heavier, as though something unseen lingered just beyond the threshold. I shut the door quickly, locking it and retreating back to the table. The book had changed again. The next page described me sitting back down, described the cold sweat dripping down my forehead and the way my hands trembled as I picked the book back up. It described my fear, my confusion, and then it spoke of something worse. It described the figure. I read in horror as the words painted a picture of something standing just outside the window, tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones, its eyes black and empty. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but its gaze was fixed on me, unblinking and endless. I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. It was there. The figure was exactly as the book described, its hollow eyes staring through the frosted glass, its head tilted slightly, as though studying me. My blood ran cold, and my body refused to move. I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating, as though it was inside the room. Despite the barrier between us, the book's words shifted again, the lines rearranging faster now, their meaning clear despite the chaos. It's waiting for you. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the figure, It didn't move, didn't blink, but I could feel its gaze burrowing into me, pulling at something deep inside. The book's pages continued to shift, the words urging me to let it in, to open the door and accept my fate. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. With a surge of panic, I grabbed the book and hurled it into the fire. The flames roared to life, consuming the brittle pages, the ancient leather. The air in the cabin grew heavier, the shadows longer, and for a moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. The figure was gone. The cabin was silent again, the only sound the crackling of the fire. I sat there, trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But even now, as I write this, I can feel it, the weight of its gaze. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the knock again. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, swallowing the world in a swirling, blinding white. I'd been out hiking, trying to clear my mind, when the first flakes began to fall. Within minutes, wind picked up, howling through the trees and sending icy shards of snow cutting across my dutter face. The trail I'd been following vanished beneath the fresh snow, and every direction looked the same. I was lost. The cold was unforgiving, biting through my jacket and gloves. My legs felt like lead as I trudged forward, hoping to stumble upon a landmark or shelter. The storm seemed alive, its roar deafening, blocking out everything except the sound of my own labored breathing. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. My name, spoken softly, almost tenderly. "Come on," the voice called. "This way." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I knew that voice. I'd recognize it anywhere. It belonged to someone I hadn't seen in years. It belonged to my best friend. My dead best friend. My heart raced as I turned, scanning the blizzard for the source of the voice. Snow whipped around me, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The voice came again, clearer this time, as though it was just on the edge of the storm. "Don't stop," it said. "I am right here." The sound of it made my chest tighten. I hadn't heard that voice in so long, but every word, every inflection, was exactly as I remembered. Memories of late-night talks, shared laughter, promises we'd never keep flooded my mind. But it wasn't possible. He was gone. I'd buried him years ago. Still, the voice was there, pulling at something deep inside me. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore it either. The storm was unrelenting, and I was running out. If there was even the slightest chance it could lead me to safety, I had to take it. "Where are you?" I shouted, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "Just follow me," the voice replied, warm and familiar. I took a step forward, then another, my boots crunching through the deep snow. The storm seemed to part slightly, the wind easing just enough to create a narrow path through the trees. Followed it, my body trembling from the cold, and the fear through me. The voice called out again, guiding me. It felt so real, so alive, that for a moment, I almost forgot the impossibility of it all. Almost. "You are so close," it said. "Don't give up." As I moved deeper into the storm, the forest grew darker. The trees loomed overhead like skeletal hands, their branches heavy with snow. The air felt heavier, colder, and every step took more effort than the last. "Do you remember this place?" the voice asked, its tone laced with something I couldn't quite place as sadness, maybe, or regret. I stopped, looking around. The forest did feel familiar, but not in the way it should have. It wasn't the trail I had set out on. This was something else, a memory I couldn't fully grasp. "I don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "Where are you leading me?" "You'll see," the voice replied, softer now. "Just a little further." The path led me to a clearing, the storm swirling around its edges like a living thing. In the center stood a lone tree, its trunk thick and gnarled, its branches stretching out like veins. At its base was something I couldn't make sense of at first, a mound of snow, small and uneven. Then I saw what was sticking out of it. A hand. The breath rushed out of me as I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The hand was pale, frostbitten, the skin stretched tightly over frozen bones. I couldn't bring myself to look away, even as dread clawed at my chest. The voice came again, louder now, closer. Why did you leave me? My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from the storm anymore. It was coming from the tree. I turned slowly, my body trembling, and saw him. He stood beneath the tree, his figure barely visible through the snow. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and frostbitten like the hand beneath the snow. His face was hollow, his eyes dark and empty, but it was him. It was my best friend. You promised, he said, his voice breaking. You promised you wouldn't leave me. Tears pricked my eyes as I stepped closer, my mind racing. This isn't real, I whispered. It can't be real. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw the friend I used to know. Laughter, the warmth, the bond we shared. But then his expression twisted, his face contorting into something darker. You left me to die, he said, his voice growing colder. And now, you'll stay with me. The ground beneath me shifted, the snow collapsing into a dark void. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the cold seeped deeper into my bones. The tree seemed to stretch and twist, its branches reaching down like claws, wrapping around me. I tried to scream, but the cold stole the breath from my lungs. The figure moved closer, his frostbitten hand reaching out, and I felt his fingers brush against my arm. They burned like ice, freezing everything they touched. I waited for you, he said, his voice echoing through the storm. And now you'll wait with me. The darkness closed in, the snow swallowing everything. My body felt heavy, immobile, though the ice itself was pulling me down. The last thing I saw was his face, twisted into that same hollow smile, his voice fading into the howling wind. I woke up in the snow, my body trembling and my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Storm had passed, and the forest was silent again. But the clearing was gone. The tree and the daunt figure nothing but a lingering nightmare. Or so I thought. As I stumbled back toward the cabin, I noticed something in the snow ahead of me. A single set of footprints, fresh and deliberate, leading into the trees. And from somewhere in the distance, I heard his voice again, soft and beckoning. Come back. The storm had pushed me deep into the woods, further than I had ever gone before. I wasn't even sure how I ended up there, stumbling through the snow, the wind tearing at my coat. The trees grew closer together, their branches heavy with frost, and the light in the overcast sky barely made it through the dense canopy. Every breath I took felt sharp and cold, and my legs burned from the effort of pushing through the deep snow. That's when I saw it. A faint shimmer in the distance, something catching the weak light, like glass or metal. Hesitated, squinting through the flurries of snow, and decided to move closer. The shimmer came from a mound of ice, strange and unnatural, rising from the ground like a frozen wave. Its surface was smooth, almost polished, and at its center, half encased in frost, was a book. It shouldn't have been there. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. Who would leave a book out here, in the middle of nowhere? And how was it frozen like that, perfectly preserved, its cover still visible through the thick layer of ice? The title was faint, the letters warped by frost, but it looked ancient, older than the forest itself. Something about it pulled me closer. My heart pounded as I reached out, my gloved hand brushing the edge of the ice. The cold was sharp, almost painful, but I couldn't pull away. Before I realized what I was doing, I was clawing at the ice, chipping away the frost, until the book was free. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, the edges frayed, but it felt warm in my hands, like it had been waiting for me. I didn't open it right away. Something about the book made my stomach twist with unease. The cover was blank except for a faint, almost ghostly imprint of a symbol with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun or a web. It was strange, almost hypnotic, and I had to force myself to look away. The storm had eased, but the cold was relentless, and I knew I couldn't stay out in the open much longer. I tucked the book under my arm and headed back the way I came, my mind racing with questions. Why was the book there? Who left it? And why had I felt so compelled to take it? By the time I reached my cabin, night had fallen. I set the book on the table, its dark cover standing out against the pale light of the oil lamp. The room felt colder than usual, the air heavy, with a stillness that made my skin crawl. Finally, I opened it. The first page was blank, the parchment yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. I turned to the next page, then the next, my fingers trembling. The handwriting was uneven, spidery, as though it had been written by someone in great haste or great fear. At first, the words made no sense. They were jumbled, fragmented, like the ramblings of a madman. But as I read, the lines began to shift, rearranging themselves into something coherent. My breath caught in my throat as the text became clear. It was writing about me. The words described the storm, the woods, and the frozen mound where I had found the book. It described my discovery of it, the way I had clawed at the ice, the exact moment I had opened its cover. My hands shook as I turned the page, the words changing as I read. They told of me sitting in the cabin, staring at the book, and then they continued describing event hadn't happened yet. The next page spoke of a knock at the door, sharp and deliberate. It spoke of me freezing in place, unable to breathe, as I waited for the second knock. And then, as if summoned by the text, the knock came. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and unnatural. My heart raced as I stared at the door, the book trembling in my hands. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The second knock came, louder. This time, more insistent. The air grew colder still, the frost creeping up my legs, biting into my skin, even through my thick clothing. The structure pulsed with light, the colors of the aurora seeping into its surface, and the faces inside pressed closer, their features more distinct, more human. And then they began to move. The figures stepped through the ice, their bodies emerging seamlessly from the surface. Were tall and thin, their skin pale and translucent, their movements unnaturally smooth. Faces were frozen in expressions of despair, but their hollow eyes burned with a faint, otherworldly glow. I backed away, my legs shaking, but the figures moved closer, their steps silent on the snow. The hum of the structure grew deafening, the aurora above twisting into a frenzied dance that made the entire clearing feel alive. "Leave," the voice commanded, sharp and cold, "before it is too late." The figures reached for me, their long, slender hands stretching out, and I turned and ran. The clearing blurred around me as I sprinted into the forest, the snow grabbing at my boots, the frost burning my skin. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel them behind me, their presence pressing against my back like a weight. The aurora above flickered violently, the colors splintering into jagged streaks of light that slashed through the trees. The hum followed me, growing fainter with each step, until finally, I stumbled into the darkness of the forest. When I emerged from the woods, the aurora was gone. The sky was clear and dark, the stars faint and distant. My breath came in ragged gasps as I collapsed into the snow, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I don't know how I found my way back to the cabin. My memory of the journey is a blur of cold and darkness, punctuated by flashes of light that may have been real or imagined. But even now, safe within these walls, I can't shake the feeling that I am being watched. The aurora hasn't returned since that night, but sometimes, when the wind is still and the air is plied, heavy, I hear the faint hum again, distant but unmistakable, and I know it's waiting,